Good afternoon and welcome back. And if you were not here yesterday, welcome to the Conference on European Economic Integration 2023. Since this is a hybrid event, I would also like to give a warm welcome to our online viewers. Yesterday we had over 80 online participants. My name is Ingrid and I'm once again supporting the chairs during their sessions. Today's program is another treasure chest filled with topical presentations and outstanding speakers. Julia Wörz, who heads the OeNB CESEE section, will be in charge of the first part of this afternoon. She's also going to introduce our today's keynote speaker, Alicia García-Herrero, and then she will segue right into session 2, that is putting the spotlight on the Belt and Road Initiative. After the break, one of the OeNB's foremost green finance experts, Andreas Breitenfellner, is going to chair session 3, that is going to highlight the green transition. And finally, the Vice Governor of the Österreichische Nationalbank, Gottfried Haber, is going to conclude the CEEI 2023 by chairing the Financial Markets Panel with the promising title, Bulls, Bears and Dragons, China's Role in Global Financial Markets. So please enjoy day 2 of the conference. And by the way, you will find the presentation slides that are made available to us on the OeNB's website and recordings of day 1 and day 2 of the conference on the OeNB's YouTube channel. In fact, yesterday's recording has already been uploaded. Dear Julia, the floor is yours now.
Thank you. Thank you, Ingrid, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here with us today again, both here in the room, but also online. There's so many dimensions about China that we already talked about yesterday. We talked about the outlook, and if I got ICA correctly, it will settle in at around 3% in the longer term. But I'm still a bit puzzled, although we had so many experts, but maybe the number of experts is the fact why I'm now puzzled. Is this a good figure? Is it too low for a country like China? Or is it actually okay, given what we are likely to hear now from our keynote speaker? Well, but I think the more important question, at least from our perspective here in Europe, is why do we care about the growth outlook for China? And clearly, we all feel the spillovers from this second biggest economy in the world. We feel the spillovers for economic growth, but also for inflation, as also Governor Holzmann and his central bank colleagues discussed yesterday. And why do we feel these spillovers? Well, we feel them because we are intrinsically integrated with the Chinese economy through trade. And our female-powered trade panel yesterday, led by Birgit, made it clear to us that we cannot and we should not decouple from China. This does not mean that there is no alternative. There is always an alternative. And the alternative to reduce our reliance, or should I say dependence on China, was also pointed to us yesterday. We were told that we need to diversify, but diversify in the meaning of the word. And to prevent trade fragmentation, because, and I think Roberta and Julia have made this very clear, that the costs from trade fragmentation are very high in economic terms, but also for security, equality, and resilience. But you're still here today because you know there are many more relevant aspects to our discussion on China and its relations with Europe. So China is an important strategic investor. Now, again, big question, is this good for the countries, the emerging economies, the developing countries where it invests? Is it good for them, or is it a threat to them? Or is it a threat to us in the West, where there's also investment by China? We will talk about this in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative in the session following the keynote lecture. And we will also talk about further dimensions such as climate change. We all face the adversities of fast climate change, and how can we embark on a green transition of our economies, and how much and what kind of cooperation with China do we need for that? As Ingrid has already announced, Andreas will lead an excellent panel later to discuss this. And then finally, China has abundant capital. It has a huge domestic savings. It has also a huge, and I was surprised yesterday that this was not mentioned more, it has a currently quite troubled real estate sector, and something which is a bit new for me, but certainly not to you as a very informed audience, is the very strong cross-border banking activities between Europe and China. And our Vice Governor will conclude with the final panel to discuss also on the role of China in financial markets. But I will stop here because we need plenty of time to discuss all these pressing issues. When our governor suggested the title China and its relations with Europe for this year's conference, the first name that came to my mind was Alicia García-Herrero. I could not think of a better speaker for our conference because Alicia excellently combines profound economic and financial knowledge with long-standing policy experience on both regions, Europe and Asia. And so I'm more than happy that she accepted our invitation to deliver the keynote speech today. Alicia is Chief Economist for Asia Pacific at Natixis, a French investment bank. She's also a Senior Fellow at the influential Brussels-based think tank Bruegel, member of the advisory board of MERICS, the Mercator Institute for China Studies, and she's affiliated to the universities of Singapore and Hong Kong. So you see, she's a very busy lady. All the more we are happy that you managed to step by in Vienna. Alicia looks beyond growth figures on the macro level and emphasizes underlying structural developments. So she says China's underwhelming recovery from COVID-0 policies need to be framed in the context of its structural deceleration. China's market will no longer be as attractive to the rest of the world, but China will still continue to exert enormous economic influence. Through its exports, as it dominates, and we've heard this yesterday, it dominates a large number of essential inputs to production and especially to green tech. So Alicia, please elaborate more on those structural developments. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Oh gosh, I'm hoping I'm not going to lose my voice right now, because I want to at least thank Governor Holzmann for inviting me and the rest of the team at the Oesterreichische Nationalbank, because this is such a pleasure, really. I learned so much from yesterday's sessions, and in fact, this morning I thought, is there anything else I can say during my keynote speech that may make this session interesting? So I revised the slides, maybe not enough to be interesting enough for you, but I am hoping that you can still get some ideas, both for the short term, the long term, as well as that very cryptic message that no matter whether China's market will actually be less appealing, not that it won't be appealing, but in terms of growth, less appealing, we will still depend so much on China, and we still need to know what's going on in China. So I'm going to start with a short run. I have to say that we have Joyce Chan's a wonderful presentation yesterday from JP Morgan, which is very similar in message to what I'm going to say. But I still want to highlight the fact that the second half of the year is going to be slightly better for China. This is great news for the world. You can, for example, see there that retail sales are starting to pick up. We'll get data very soon for October. And most importantly, it's no longer about services. It was until September, it was mostly services. We're starting to see some auto sales, real kind of consumption, consumption durables coming back, but very slowly. What is really important, and we had data today, is not updated, but I do know that exports were still very weak, -6%, and imports actually increased. Finally, they're no longer negative. It happens to be an expo in Shanghai, so one wonders. But still, the data is good, which is interesting. But as you can see, if you think about China's trade size in the world, I mean, with imports basically growing negatively during many months, that idea that the market won't be as appealing, I think, should be clear to all of us. I will show you later whether this is only about growth or there is something else happening. And there is something else happening. The other important thing is this big trade balance, not this month, as I mentioned, it will be smaller, but China has been keeping a huge trade balance for months and years. And the question is, why is this the case if China has been growing above the rest of the world for so long? Why is China still keeping such a huge trade surplus? Is it because of competitiveness? Is it because China needs it? Maybe both, but the second is also true, and I will show you in a minute why this is the case. So on competitiveness, we could talk about all kinds of competitiveness. China is, of course, moving up the ladder, no doubt about it, but there's a very easy way of competitiveness, and that is exchange rate and deflation. Both together make to a huge increase in competitiveness or external competitiveness for China, as you can see here from the real effective exchange rate. So we're talking about 11% at least, and Junma and I were having a conversation yesterday on exactly this. So, I mean, bear in mind that China has gained so much competitiveness against the rest of the world, having exports falling. Now that we are no longer in this kind of double recession environment, the US and Europe, nobody can say by now, oh, this is because of recession elsewhere. No, exports are still falling, notwithstanding that gain in competitiveness. And it'll be important to see why this is the case. On investment, this graph was right there yesterday, I think, so it's a repeated graph, but I wanted to highlight the fact that while we focus a lot on the real estate sector, of course, the real estate sector is bringing down the Chinese economy. We've estimated the impact on 2023's growth to be around 1.5 percentage points. So China could be growing 6.5. But 6.5 is still lower than 2021, 8.1. So you can see that there is some structural factors beyond the real estate. Now, those structural factors can be seen in this graph. Beyond the very negative growth of the real estate sector in gray, you can see the manufacturing sector. Think about it, yeah? Huge competitive gains because deflation, because of a very cheap exchange rate. And, you know, you have figures where China dominates very, very new markets, EVs, etc. Why is fixed asset investment in manufacturing lower than it has ever been? This is a question I have, yeah? So you can see that there is some structural trends that are hard to pinpoint, but you can see in the data that are there, and it's not a data point, it's basically structural deceleration. On outbound FDI, I just want to highlight my graph again. You had data yesterday on the change in inbound FDI in China being negative for the first time. So there's basically more money out, FDI-wise, than money in. And that's a big change. Again, you are starting to see big structural changes in China. One important thing which brings me back to the trade surplus. I said, why do they need a trade surplus? Because they have capital outflows. And capital outflows are nearly as big as they were in 2015, which is a horror year for China, as you recall. $1 trillion forex reserves basically disappeared. No reserves are disappearing now. It's kind of, where's the money? Well, first of all, you have a trade surplus. And secondly, are the reserves we see at the PBOC all of the reserves that China has, or are there other dollars there in the banking sector? You know, there's many questions here, but I'm saying it is obvious that the outflows are large and that the trade surplus is needed, and that weak exchange rate, let alone deflation, is after all not such a horrible thing to have in the current circumstances. Of course, not too weak an exchange rate. So that's why you have nearly a peg by now, 7.3. There you go, stable, because you don't want to have expectations of additional depreciation because those outflows will only increase. Real estate sector, I did hear the point. Actually, I cut this very short in the presentation, but is there a recovery? The answer is no. There's no recovery yet. Should there be? Probably no. Because when you look at the excess supply, basically land transactions hover around 100,000 a month. This is coming from basically 3 times as much. So it is happening, the adjustment is happening, but it needs more time. And I think that's why you have still prices basically growing at in negative territory, or depending on the data you use, stable or negative. Of course, tier 3 cities are much worse. And most importantly, and for me, this is the main risk. I always say, look, I understand the real estate sector is what we hear, but focus on the local governments, because that's where the action will be, in my view. Or we might not see the action, but that's where the action will be without perhaps seeing it fully. And you can see there, the value, let alone the space, of land transactions, mainly from local governments, is plummeting. And this is a major source of tax revenue for local governments in China. So you can see that there's a lot of tension, obviously, at the local government level. And you can read, any readout you have from any economic meeting, you can see that that's clearly in everybody's mind. Is China reacting to this key question? Okay, so if this is the situation, and even the competitiveness gained through, if not deflation, stable prices, let's call it this way, exchange rate, etc., is not enough, why are they not doing more? And if you look at interest rates, they could do so much more. If you look at fiscal, maybe not. But, we heard yesterday, 100% public debt is not such a terrible thing for China. Yes, of course, because it's financed by domestic savings. But still, the burden of the debt is more about productivity. It's about what misallocation of resources. Where is this money going? So for me, the reason why China probably doesn't do more is, first, the exchange rate, as far as the interest rate is concerned, the Fed, the idea of outflows, as I mentioned, so that constraint. And on the fiscal, I think it's more like, is it going to get any better? This is the question. If I were, sitting, which I'm not, but if I were, would I say, okay, wait a minute, if I need to use some fiscal stabilizer, I need to know that growth is going to go higher, so that, I can argue that this is the time to use fiscal. But that's not what I think anybody is expecting. So why use the fiscal space now if you might need it even more in the future? And that gives a lot of headaches, in my opinion, for China to continue to issue. They've announced 1 trillion RMB, as you probably have heard. But a lot of that is basically avoiding the cliff from last year, because they issued about 500 billion. So a lot is keeping the machine, let alone doing a huge stimulus beyond that huge machine. Yeah, if you have that kind of fiscal deficit, which is augmented, I'm not saying it's consolidated, you can believe it or not, the IMF has similar figures, but it is a very large fiscal deficit overall. So structural deceleration. So this is the point I was supposed to cover. I'll be fast. So this is based on a paper published by Bruegel. It's called Defying Gravity. Can China defy gravity? The answer is no, but by the way, nobody can defy gravity. So there is a negative message is, yes, China will decelerate structurally, but the positive, everybody does after you reach $10,000 per capita, and China is already well beyond that. So why expect China to continue to grow at whatever level? Even the current level, 5%, will not be maintained, simply because China is already, in a way, in that slower convergent path as possibly any country. So what we did is we checked the best performing on Earth. The best performing, looking at growth 10 years after you reach $10,000 per capita, is South Korea. South Korea grew during those 10 years 5.5%. And China, with those numbers, is basically a very simple model of convergence of labor productivity, and nothing that people would actually, Ika yesterday mentioned much worse numbers, and I will say very likely this is just a convergence play, but the downward pressure is, I would say, quite strong. So when you see that and you calculate it is lower than South Korea, about the same as Japan. So I would say success. If we reach that, very simply, I would say, well, quite good for China, moving out of middle income trap. We estimated this to be around $25,000 per capita by 2035. frankly, not bad. But the problem is the risks to this scenario are very high. And that's the issue. Of course, the most obvious is aging. Everybody says aging. Well, aging is not a risk, it's a fact. Because by now we know, what China's fertility rate is. And let me tell you that the worst happens only in about 20 years or 15 years. Because that's when you have the huge reduction, additional reduction in the fertility rate in China from 2019. And on top of that, the other reason why actually aging is not what is driving the story now is that China is still urbanizing. This means that, and we calculated here, the impact of China's aging or reduction or depopulation, if you like, doesn't hit the economy very aggressively for now, because the population falls in the rural areas and continues to increase slightly in the cities where the productivity is higher. So end effect is until 2035 or so, when urbanization hits the kind of equilibrium level. It's not that is decelerating China's growth. And thereafter, though, I have to say, I'm sorry to say this, but you will see, this is in blue there, around 1.2% less growth than I showed you a minute ago. So if we were at 2.3 by 2035, just a slash, about 1.2%, because finally, aging. I mean, you can think of many other things that may happen to China, increasing labor productivity, robotization. I mean, they may mitigate this impact. But the point is, don't think the structural deceleration you are seeing now is because of aging. It's because of something else. And what is that something else? Many factors. Most important factor, the return on assets is plummeting. And it's not a year. It's continued to plummet. And by the way, we have a graph in that defying gravity. I don't think I put it in because I thought I'm never going to finish this presentation on time. But that shows you, and we calculated that with microdata, that the private sector, which used to be much more productive, return on assets was much higher, like 3 times the public sector, is converging. And if you read what's going on with the private sector, you may think, well, maybe so. Now, of course, nothing is written in stone. Maybe population issues are more written in stone, but innovation is not written in stone. China could be so innovative that they could somehow mitigate this structural deceleration by investing in R&D, which they are doing. So as you see in the red line there, they are at the level of Europe at the current juncture, 2.2% of GDP in R&D. But look at the US. Actually, this is the same graph as JP Morgan. I felt, did they receive my presentation? Maybe. I swear I had my graphs before. So, but anyway, that graph was there. And interestingly, I mean, in terms of productivity, who cares where the US is going? I mean, as far as China is investing more, that should be enough. The problem, though, is that while you see that in every intermediate measures such as patents, scientific publications, or even value added to exports, you see that this innovation is paying off. You don't see it in total factor productivity. So why? Maybe because innovation is not equal total factor productivity, is it? There's other things that matter, rule of law, institutions, you name it. And I think this is the key, that can innovation only push up China's growth? Question mark. So far, we've not seen it. So, impact on China, deceleration on the rest of the world. I have to really speed up. So first of all, when we think that China is kind of no longer exporting as much and so on, bear in mind that we are at a different level. China gained so much export share during COVID that before it loses that export share, it's going to take a while. So, China is magnificently large in the trade space everywhere. And you can see that from that humongous increase during 2021 of exports. And this is China's trade by partner. You can see how China now is mainly exporting to the BRICS rather than Europe or the US. So 2 things happening. China's trade is much bigger. It's falling, but from a very large base. Second, it's exporting elsewhere. less so to Europe and the US. And this is the export share I mentioned, so it's basically 18% of global exports, huge increase during COVID. And import share increasing slightly during COVID, back. So this is the message. The message is, in the quote, increasingly I feel that the market, China's market, won't be the main story. The main story will be sourcing our market depending on Chinese goods that China will continue to propel because of massive gains in competitiveness, both of which so far price, but of course value added in exports has increased too, so both. This is what I told you we had calculated, which is basically the import elasticity. So you can see from 2016, China's import happens to be the year that, China, made in China 2025 to 2015 is very coincidental, but point is that China has started to import less independently on its growth. Call it self-reliance, call it as you like, but that's what you see when you just estimate import elasticity. Now, on channels, should we then, so if the market is not going to be so important because the import elasticity is smaller, what about investment? Well, investment, even inbound, already I mentioned to you, is really not as our companies investing in China is less and less important. In value of transactions were really much lower. What about China coming here to buy? You're right, huge savings. Julia said that. Well, it is not happening. Most of the increase in FDI is in the Belt and Road countries. It's not in Europe or the US anymore. Of course, some, rightly so, will say, because we were not allowing this investment. I mean, in the case of Europe, I don't think this can be argued, because I've checked the numbers of our inbound screening coordination mechanism. We've stopped 13, and they're very small. So I don't think that's the main reason for Europe, but we could discuss that. And then we heard Chinese banks are, lending everywhere in the world. They used to, but now actually the rate of change is negative. And I don't have the numbers here, but I can give to anybody who is interested. It's in a recent paper at Bruegel on the role of the RMB internationally, mostly in RMB, and mostly, of course, to BRI economies. So, in a nutshell, China's own push through dual circulation, self-reliance, to me means that maybe the key, of course, China will be huge, no doubt about it, but I'm talking about the change. The marginal effect will not be as large for our companies. But China's influence in everywhere in the world through its own exports, and in some cases, as I will show you, magnificently large export share, of the order of 90% for some goods. That's what will matter the most. So the reason for this, I think, is not only the fact that China is indeed, in a way, more inward-looking import-wise, but also the financial constraints. China's own financial constraints, which doesn't allow China to invest as much as it used to in the rest of the world, certainly not to lend. And of course, also US containment. So this is a mixture of why these things are happening. And I think I have no time, so I'm going to rush through this, but
2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay, 2 minutes. This is just an aperitif for the last session of today. So let me tell you that when I zoom into that idea, China as a sourcing power, more than China as a market power, there is one sector that stands out, that is green tech, our green transition. What stands in between us and our green transition, renewables. And when you see that, it's just, this is based on a paper also published by Bruegel called De-risking while decarbonizing. So the title says it all. Can we decarbonize while still de-risk? And it explains why we should de-risk. Of course, this is up to everybody to, to think whether right or wrong, but we take we take the stance there that we should de-risk simply because they concentrate. So forget about China. Cross the name China and put there any name. US. And I would still say we need to de-risk because the degree of concentration of our sourcing for something as important as our green transition is so huge that it doesn't really matter which country it is. And that's what we try to say in that paper. Because so we talk about the supply chain overall, whether it's extraction, you can see natural graphite. By the way, there was a little bit of a tension because of announced export controls in that graphite in that recently, but you can see, you know, how humongous that red area, which is China, is for many of the minerals needed for renewables. And refining is much worse, by far, as you know. And it's not only rare earth metals, but actually much more. And this is very interesting. This comes from the Commission, by the way, DG Growth. You can see the dependence on China's patents from solar, wind, ion batteries, you name it. So it is also about innovation. It's not only about critical raw materials. And we have examples, I'll stop here, but of where exactly. So, you know, Europe exports unrefined silicon, believe it or not, from Germany, Wacker, and others. And then we import massive processed silicon wafers from China. And I could go on and on. So, you know, it's kind of strange because you would have imagined the opposite. It's not the opposite. That's the way it works. And our value added in the whole solar PV supply chain is only 25 billion, the green there. That's it. And we import over 90% of our solar products from China. And by the way, in 2005, we had over 50% of the market. That's it. So, you know, it's hard to explain, but this is what has happened. We have the example of wind turbines, where China is less present, but much more than Europe by now. And the same is true for, of course, battery supplies, where the other player is South Korea. So what we say here is that the reason for the risking is not only about the obvious, which is potential disruptions because of retaliation. That's the obvious, but it's not the only one. The main point we make in the paper is that, and we have estimates of how much renewable China will need for its own decarbonization, and how difficult it will be for China to peak in 2030. We make all of those numbers to argue, let's help, let's have basically a supplementary, not a substitute, a supplementary supply chain to build more, and also not to be stuck with the same technology, which is another very important point to create a different supply chain. And also because there is unintended risks. Some are not intended, they may not be intended. China may have the best intentions and still is too concentrated for anything to happen, from climate disaster, you name it. So we propose a partnership. I can explain that anytime later. You can read the paper, but we basically say, let's create a supplementary supply chain and let's involve other countries, not only Europe, not only the G7. Turkey would be great in terms of, you know, economies of scale, India, you name it. So we make that point that we need more of these renewables. And this should not be read as an anti-China scheme. It's just a question of common sense, because the whole world is too dependent. In a way, China is too dependent on itself, if you think about it, because there is no other supplier, if something were to happen in China. So to conclude, I guess the points I wanted to make today is that the second half of 2023 will be, in my opinion, slightly better. Not much better, but I don't think we'll have any big shock coming from China. 2024, very similar, 4.5, but the point is the direction, the structural deceleration. Will China continue to be a humongous market for us? Slightly less so. It doesn't mean it won't be important, but slightly less so. So should we think, oh, once upon a time we used to talk about Japan and there was no de-risking, but we don't talk about Japan. No, that's not the case with China, because China has an export share that Japan never reached. And Japan never reached concentrations of certain exports, which are critical for the world, as China has. That's the difference. And that's the main difference. So in that regard, I think we need to work out that idea for the benefit of everybody, including China, in ways that make that more resilient, that supply chain, especially for decarbonization. That's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Or here, or wherever you like. Thank you, Alicia, for these very interesting thoughts and facts. And I gave you 2 more minutes because actually I asked you to talk about this partnership, as I thought it would nicely fit into our conference as well, especially giving a bit of food for thought for Andreas' section. So there are already some pressing questions. Andreas has raised his hand, but if there are more, please raise your hands. I will collect a few. And yeah, okay, so I see Susanne, Ika. Let's collect 3, and Andreas, please first.
So thank you very much, and I can confirm you, we got a lot of new messages here. It was not just repetitive, and you helped us to understand things much better than we understood
keep your
yesterday.
Short, so we have time
Absolutely,
for more
yeah,
questions.
that's over for the first part. Second, on real estate. I have a difficulty to understand why China should not need more real estate, actually. I mean, a lot of families are living in very small apartments, so generally you would think the need over the next 20, 30 years, even with demographic change, would rather increase than decline. But of course, there's a kind of financing problem of real estate, but the demand for real estate shouldn't be smaller, but rather bigger. And the second issue is only sanctions. You didn't mention US sanctions. And is this a kind of fact to understand also perhaps the real estate bubble? Because a real estate bubble can only burst if there is a declining confidence. And perhaps this declining confidence comes actually from the regime shift in the United States, basically, yeah? with Trump introducing the first sanctions and then leading also to repatriation of FDI, including Apple and so on. Also, it's very popular in China, things like this.
Thank you, Andreas. I immediately take Susanne's question up here.
Yes, you've talked about places where China is dominant. In what markets could Europe be dominant?
Thank you for this very short but very relevant question. Ika is just on your left. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Have a very fascinating presentation as always. Actually, I have a comment on the last part of the presentation on, say, China's dominance in certain sectors, sort of green tech. I mean, we have well, in Finland and Sweden, there's actually are many of these rare earth metals being mined at the moment, and there is a very serious attempt to have a major battery factory in Finland. But for that, we actually need Chinese technology. We need Chinese patents, and we need Chinese expertise in how to run things at the industrial scale. So now the tables perhaps will turn, and it's our turn to reverse engineer China's patents and so on. Thanks.
Thank you, Ike. We give Alicia a chance to answer, because these are 4 questions
yes,
by now.
Thank you.
And then we take another round.
So I'll be brief. Real estate. Do we still need so many housing units in China so that this correction is excessive, say? Well, there's a very big income distribution issue in China, and also the fact that you have the hukou. Basically, you would need more units maybe in tier 1 cities where the prices have fallen much less, but maybe not in tier 3, third-tier cities where there's not enough population and people might not find a job. So there is a dislocation of the market. That's one thing I wanted to say. On the sanctions, frankly speaking, I don't think that's the reason for it. It's a good point. I was like very impressed by, but I think what happened was that in August 2020, the Chinese government introduced the 3 red lines, and that was the trigger. They were only fully imposed upon, especially Evergrande, in the spring, early summer of 2021, which is when Evergrande basically defaults on its foreign debt. why did the government do that? Because basically, if you read Xi Jinping's speeches, it's very clear. Housing is for living, not for speculation. So the idea, and rightly so, I have to say, that that sector was bloated and excessively large is right. Maybe could you do that more smoothly? You know, I think goes beyond topic, but very briefly, I think Xi Jinping has this idea, or at least my reading of what he's doing, that there is too much, and rightly so, by the way, again, too much capital deployed in the wrong sectors in China. So real estate was 20% of listed assets in China, as opposed to 5% in the US. You can tell. Yeah, with different population dynamics. It just was too big. The other sector that probably in his mind was too big was the tech sector, but it was mostly e-commerce, not basic research. You know, so you can see that in a way there is this attempt to organize or reallocate capital in China to more productive sectors. I think that's the main reason. I actually don't think it's the sanctions. We could talk about other sectors for which the sanctions may be relevant, but I don't think it's a real estate. Quickly, what should we do, we Europeans? No, should we be influential in anywhere? Of course. I'm very, very pro-European. I mean, I'm sorry, but living in Asia for so long, I became even more European, because I actually think that our model of consensus base is very appealing for the world, because we're not a very competitive or strong power given what we see. But exactly for that reason, in a world of great power competition, it's very hard for Europe to be influential. That's the irony. So I can't say more because no time. Am I missing? ICA, yes, ICA and...
On the inputs we need from China.
Sorry?
If I remember correctly, the inputs...
Yes, ICA I have, but I'm missing another one. EU...
Not... I think it's fine.
Yeah, sorry, maybe, yeah. So ICA, one thing for me is that this idea of patents is very important, but I've actually checked, we are writing a paper on the quality of Chinese patents in the sectors where the US is containing, so export controls, and seeing how far China is, which is quite important. But the other one is on green. And yes, the patents are humongous, but they're mostly efficiency patents, meaning procedural, and the whole point here is if you were to deviate to different technology, maybe you would have a chance. So the idea is there any other technology? And I'm not an expert, but in the seminar that we had on the 24th of October, there was an expert there, a German expert, explaining that I was shocked to hear that the solar panels we're importing, 90% from China, are not the best we could import because of the geography of Europe, because we need smaller solar panels with different technology, and that this technology has not been developed because we're importing everything. So there's a lot of things to think about, whether we should not be rethinking the whole thing, whether we are having the best of the transitions we can, given our geography. So that's what I would say, yeah.
We are actually almost at the end, but I would like to give Waltraud and Daniel a chance. And then, since there are so many more hands, I refer you to the next break. But please, Waltraud, very briefly, and also Daniel, just behind her.
Do you see a dilemma between raising wages and to boost private consumption and foreign competitiveness? My first question. Second question, you mentioned that the capital is leaving China. Is this capital flight? Okay. The dampening investment inside China.
Okay.
And Daniel, just behind.
Right. Looking further ahead, if you have this demographic transition, presumably this implies a much smaller current account surplus and less capital exports over time. And you consider that there's going to be a problem for global growth, that China will not be able to invest as much also in emerging markets, developing countries. So also there's a spillover that way.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay.
We stop it here, and
yes,
then there will be a break where Alicia will still be here.
The reality is, can wage increases create more consumption? So China did that from 2008, massive wage increases to 2010 onwards, 10% wage increases. But the increase in consumption to GDP was quite moderate. I would say that now you don't even have that because disposable income is quite stagnant. So you know, I do think that part of the consumption might have some income constraints. But the reality is that when you look at savings in 2023, the saving ratio has increased rather than decreased, which is what happened everywhere in the world after COVID, yeah? So I guess there's a part which is, somebody said that sentiment, whether it's about the US or something else, we can debate. But I think basically Chinese are not spending, not because they don't have the means, in some cases maybe, but overall, given the excess savings, maybe not. Maybe there's other reasons, maybe uncertainty about the future, etc. So I'm not sure. And by the way, the government realizes exports are key for growth now. Because of the second question, because fixed asset investment needs to continue to come down. So, you know, they just have to export. And yes, once it comes down, these excess savings can be deployed in the rest of the world. But for that, you need to be sure, and this is a capital outflow story, your second question, that money will stay, that you have that luxury, if you see what I mean, that you can go and invest all over the world because there's confidence so that capital does not fly. So out of the, so first of all, the balance of payment is very hard to read. It's very hard to read. One thing that can hint at the capital flight is the difference between the trade balance and the current account. If you check that, it's very weird. It was very weird over in 2019. We estimated the excess expenditure of tourists from China at around 150 billion. So literally, China's tourism, import of services through tourism was 1/3 of China's imports. Nowhere in the world. I mean, it's impossible. So 10% of Chinese have a passport. You know, it's impossible. So you see, it's so there is capital flight, but it's very hard to measure. But what I showed you is not capital flight. It's outright portfolio disinvestment. Mostly fixed income because of interest rate differential. This is true in many countries, not only China, but also equity because the Chinese equity market has done so poorly in 2023. So I think I've taken all of the questions.
Yeah. Thank you. And let's give a big hand again to Alicia. And please, would you mind to stay here for, okay. And we move straight, thank you. We move straight to the next session on the Belt and Road Initiative. Stefan, may I ask you to join us here on the stage? Please come. And Christoph Rebesch, thank you for joining us online. I know he's online. At least I've seen him already online. And he will, I'm sure we will see him a little later. Well, the Belt and Road Initiative, it's a highly visible means by which China increases its global influence. It's a project which is also very much to the heart of the President, Xi Jinping, who launched the initiative exactly 10 years ago in Kazakhstan in September 2013. And it forms part of China's Global Development Initiative, through which China wants to assume the global leadership along with its rising economic power. So as such, this project is part of China's second centennial goal. The target completion date is therefore 2049, which marks the first centennial of the foundation of the People's Republic of China. Have you been aware of this immense strategic importance of the Belt and Road Initiative in China? I mean, I must admit I was not, but I prepared for this panel, so now I know it. But still, we are all aware of the Belt and Road Initiative because it is very visible in our media very often. Just think of what Birgit mentioned yesterday, the $1 billion Chinese-built highway in Norway. In Montenegro. I'm sorry. Montenegro. The Greek port of Piraeus, the Nene Teresa airport near Tirana, Chinese investments in railway, infrastructure, wind parks, solar power, logistics centers, etc., 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 in Europe and elsewhere. And let me mention a last example, which nicely brings out the complexity of this subject. This summer, I traveled to Dubrovnik over the newly built Belješac Bridge. And you may all have seen the pictures of this brand new, elegant bridge, which now allows all provinces of Croatia to be in the Schengen area without having to cross any borders. The construction was quick, as it could rely on Chinese material, Chinese workers, working under Chinese conditions. Maybe it would not have been completed in time by Croatia's Schengen accession if the Austrian Strabag, which was also competing and had a very attractive offer as well, would have built it because they would need to observe also EU conditions. Even though I should mention that in this case, the financing was actually majority EU funds. But we seem to face severe trade-offs, and I think this example illustrates that. And let us now discuss these following questions with two experts on this topic, Stefan Barisic and Christoph Trebesch. So let us discuss how important is Chinese investment in Europe, what is the outlook for future investments, and what is the impact both in economic and in political terms? Should we be afraid of a Chinese debt diplomacy? And how can Europe, how can the West respond to the Belt and Road Initiative? We will start with a brief presentation by Stefan, and then we will have a few rounds of questions among the panelists, and then there will be time for discussions again, for questions from the audience, from you. So please keep your questions ready. And I will also call in a voice from the internet to broaden our view. So stay tuned. But let me first briefly introduce Stefan, my colleague, who is senior economist in our CESEE analysis section at the OeNB. As an economic historian, he knows everything about the economic history between Vienna and Vladivostok. And you can read more on this in his book on Central Asia and the Silk Road, which has been translated into German and very recently to Russian as well. So focusing on the most recent developments in the Belt and Road Initiative, Stefan says that recently Chinese overseas commitments have declined in the Western world. They have partly recovered in the global South. And we see that Chinese projects have become on average smaller, and private and greenfield investments have been on the rise. Stefan, please take the floor and tell us more about the recent developments of overseas Chinese investments.
Well, thank you very much, Julia. It's an honor for me to give this presentation here, this distinguished audience. To move on, yeah, that's the way it goes. Okay. So the essential points I will present are, first of all, an overview of Chinese overseas investment and construction in the last decade. Then I will focus on most recent years, the last 4.5 years, from 2019 to mid-2023, where we see a quantitative downsizing and a regional refocusing. Then I'll quickly look at the sectoral composition of this, of these investments or this construction. Then at China's reaction to the most recent crises, like the COVID-19, advanced economies, interest rate hikes, and Russia's war in Ukraine. And this reaction has contributed to the quantitative downsizing most recently. And then I'll look at emerging Western rival programs to the Belt and Road Initiative. Then I'll switch back to the BRI and try to give an outlook. Oh, sorry. Now, Chinese global and Belt and Road investment and construction. In this graph, you see sort of a movement from exuberance to moderation. And this covers the last decade. Before I go into the graph, a quick reference to data. Now, these are project or investment oriented. This is a project or investment oriented perspective, not a credit or debt oriented one, as we often have. Our data source here is the so-called China Global Investment Tracker of the American Enterprise Institute, Washington, D.C. And these are data, these are overseas investment and construction data as disclosed by investing firms, not balance of payments data. Plus, another limitation is that the China Global Investment Tracker only counts transactions that are above $95 million per deal, which is an understandable but important limitation. Here, the focus will be on China's entire overseas investment and construction data, not only on data of Belt and Road projects, because the border between these is sometimes fuzzy. Now a look at the graph itself. We see here in green color investment, and in pink color construction. And the lighter shades of these color show you Belt and Road countries, defined as countries that have signed so-called Belt and Road memoranda with China. And the dark colors show those that haven't, so are not so-called Belt and Road countries. Now, we see the apex reached at around 2017, and then from 2018, things went down. Yet commitments to Belt and Road countries, that is countries that signed these cooperation documents with China, mostly emerging markets, developed more positively and then contracted less than engagements overall. And from 2018, I will come back to this again later, we can see a political blowback against Chinese investments in the West, compared to a shrinkage followed by stabilization, given all these crises, in Belt and Road countries. And about 1/5 of the total are troubled transactions, as seen from the perspective of firms. One could compare these with non-performing loans, but the term is troubled transactions because it's not seen from banks, it's seen from the perspective of investing firms. Now, coming to this refocus, sorry, this change of focus, Chinese overseas commitments sharply declining in the West and partly recovering in the global South. Here I have a sequence of pie charts running from 2019 to 2023. The blue color refers to so-called Western countries, including Australia and New Zealand, coming from the left to the right, Australia and New Zealand, then East Asia, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, then North America, the US and Canada, the UK, the EU, and the Western Balkans. And the rest are so-called emerging markets, if you wish. So here we see, if we look at 2022 here, and before we have 2019, and before we have, or here the slide is 2023. So we see here a progressive expansion of investment, although the total amount of investment contracted within this total amount, there we have a strong expansion of the share of emerging markets and a contraction, the share of the Western countries. Total contraction was from 31% in 2019 to 15% in the first half of 2023. The share of the EU contracted from 14% to 7%, whereas the share of relatively large emerging market blocks, the ASEAN, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America, together with emerging markets like Central Asia, Russia, slices of green, although Russia is not always shown here, because there are some years where there was no investment, expands from 47% in 2019 to 82% in the first half year of 2023. However, most recently, there have been some setbacks in large traditional emerging market partners, large BRI partners, Pakistan because of high indebtedness, or with that as a background, Russia, highly sanctioned, risky, India, following a flare-up of military tensions with China in 2020, the Indian authorities adopted a more restrictive stance to Chinese investment. However, most recently in 2022, China has once again become India's #1 trading partner. Now a quick look I can't go into too much detail here at the sectoral breakdown of Chinese overseas commitments in the last 4 years, not in the last 10 years. And here we have the majority, more than 2/3 of it, consists of energy, transportation, and metals. For example, steel, aluminum, molybdenum, and so on. Within Chinese overseas commitments, interestingly, real estate is also quite important in some countries like Singapore. Entertainment is important in Europe. Technology is relatively less important than one might think. Utilities, chemicals, health, etc., etc. I will have to skip this here, but perhaps this gives a breakdown on the most important investment partners of China, seen from the investing firms, country by country, in descending order of the size of this investment. And here we already see that Western countries are not the most important partners in the last 3 to 4 years. But I may be able to go into detail on that later on. Now, in the face of accumulated troubled transactions, about 1/5 of the total, and risks, China has provided generous refinancing rescue loans of over $200 billion, most recently. Christoph may be able to speak more about that. Overall, Chinese investment overseas has slowed down, as we've seen in the graph. Average overseas projects have become smaller. Therefore, the China Global Investment Tracker data may be increasingly underrepresenting total Chinese project spending going forward. So this may be too pessimistic graph or too pessimistic view. 8 years ago, the average project size of Chinese investments was $500 million. Now it's below, or last year it was below 400 million. Meanwhile, shares of private and greenfield investments have been on the rise. Private investments increased from 36% in 2019 to almost 50% in the first half year of 2023. Why? Well, one might classically argue simply that in risky markets, state-owned enterprises with their much deeper financial resources have acted as initial risk takers and pioneers in Belt and Road undertakings, now to be followed by increasing participation of private companies, big competitive Chinese private companies. Or private firms may raise less suspicion in partner countries. Greenfield investments have grown from about 42% in 2019 to over 61% in the first half year of 2023. Why? Well, receding Chinese acquisitions and takeovers in Western countries may contribute to explaining the increasing share of greenfield outlays in total in investment overseas, given that emerging markets, developing countries tend to show more construction projects than advanced economies. Now a quick look at emerging Western competition for the Belt and Road Initiative. The country with most experience and with most success so far has been Japan, with its Partnership for Quality Infrastructure program, with the emphasis on quality. The total amount that has been envisaged is approximately, I may no longer be fully up to date, about $200 billion, of which about $125 billion was already spent. And the focus is, of course, because the Japanese economy is a lot smaller than the Chinese economy, the focus is on the neighbors of Japan, East, South, and Southeast Asia. Then we have the broader Western reaction. The G7, led by the United States, proclaimed the so-called Build Back Better World program, B3W, that was in June 2021, still in the COVID era, not much happened then. It was then rebranded a year later, Program for Growth in Infrastructure and Investment, PGII. $600 billion envisaged, of which the US is to contribute about $200 billion, but this is not public money. There's very little public money included in this. This is private sector money that should be mobilized. Now, The B3W and respectively the PGII aim to catalyze private sector funding with limited public money for 4 key areas: climate in emerging markets, climate, health, digitalization, and gender equity. The EU has launched its own infrastructure investment initiative, the so-called Global Gateway, a bit earlier. That was already in December 2021, so that's now about 2 years ago, almost. The Global Gateway is to correspond to European values and thus to fulfill most elevated social and environmental standards. And up to 2027, EU organs, for example, the European Investment Bank and member states, seek to mobilize up to 300 billion euros, mostly from the European private sector. Here again, we don't know how much public money is there in this. Where is it? How, I don't quite know what subsidies will be there. For intelligent and sustainable infrastructure investment in developing countries. And while there are important plans, for example, to install high-grade underwater cable connections for data transmission between the EU and Africa on the one hand, and the EU and Latin America on the other, so far not very much has become concrete. There has, however, been a Global Gateway Forum in Brussels a couple of weeks ago, and here it was stated that there are about 90 projects that are subsumed in this initiative and that should still receive their starting shot before the end of this year. So we will see how things evolve and how many of these projects are really new projects.
Stefan, may I ask you to be very brief on the outlook? Because we have only 1 minute left.
Okay. This is actually already the outlook. I would argue that the Belt and Road is moving toward a leaner and apparently greener and more focused nature. Despite impressive expansion, more than $1 trillion of investment and construction deals in 2013 until end September 2023, so this is wrong. It's more than $1 trillion, it's not nearly. Some serious setbacks have confronted the BRI in recent years. As mentioned, the COVID pandemic, BRI and developing country debt crisis. We will hear more of this later from Christoph, probably. The impact of sharp interest rate hikes in advanced economies from early 2022, and the fallout of Russia's war in Ukraine, and of the economic war between the West and Russia from 2022. And there has been, of course, lots of criticism and controversy. One reads it in the press to a great degree: corruption, opacity, incompetence of project management in some cases, environmental damage, and the so-called debt trap diplomacy, that where debt was accumulated and increased substantially in many countries by the Belt and Road Initiative, and China has then generously provided refinancing credits of a couple of $100 billion. But it's difficult to argue that a debt trap has materialized through asset seizure in partner countries, because there's lack of evidence of that. There's actually only one point, but I don't have time for that.
Yeah, and we have time for discussion later on. So
exactly.
I think this would actually be a great part to stop, if you don't mind.
It's just a half a minute.
Half a minute.
Yes, please. I'm so near the end here. Thank you. But no doubt China has increased its global influence through the new Silk Road, and various countries have become more dependent on China, notably relatively small countries like Montenegro, the Maldives, or Laos, whose external debt has increased substantially due to realization of infrastructure projects regarded as important by the respective host country authorities. We shouldn't forget that. And here, finally, given recent difficulties encountered, Chinese authorities have decided to rationalize overseas engagements. Overall, according to recent expert analysis, 4 types of investment, primarily of a smaller, more often private or greenfield nature, can be expected or may continue within the framework of the Belt and Road, or more generally. These 4 here: strategic engagements, transportation infrastructure, connectivity. This has remained important from the start out, and there's still lots of need for that, apparently. Energy resource-backed deals, national security for China with its neighbors, whether it's Central Asia or Russia, digital projects, and green transition projects. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, thank you also for raising already quite a few issues that we will discuss on. And I have the pleasure now to introduce to you my second panelist, or third, in fact, if I may also count Alicia as a panelist also to this discussion. I'm sure you can also contribute here. Christoph Treves, I hope we can see him also on the screen soon. Christoph is a professor at, oh, hi. Hello, Christoph. I hope you can hear us well. At least we can see you. He's professor at Kiel University and head of the Research Center International Finance and Macroeconomics at the famous Kiel Institute for World Economics. And last year, he also founded a new, very topical research area on geopolitics and economics. And we actually know Christoph already for his expertise on the rise of China as an investor and the debt implications of these investments. He has spent enormous time and efforts to obtain information on Chinese debt contracts some years ago, which is, I think, one of the, well, a difficult task, to say the least. According to Christoph, China has often invested in countries that actually turned out to have particularly severe problems, and that came also through in Stefan's presentations. So that problems are increasing and investments are falling, and yet Chinese influence has grown worldwide. And so I may quote Christoph very briefly, the BRI is dead, long live the Belt Road Initiative. And I think I will immediately turn with my first question to Christoph now. So what do you think is currently at stake for the Belt and Road Initiative? And how do you assess the prospects of this initiative, also taking into account the current geopolitical tensions that have been alluded to before?
Thank you so much for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to listen to the inputs. So, well, that's a big question. So where is this heading? What are the prospects? I do think, you know, the initial excitement, the initial kind of boom era of the Belt and Road is over by now. The lending boom has very much turned into a bust, at least in some of the countries. And there is a recognition that quite a number of projects did not turn out the way they should have. Quite a number of countries, especially the lowest income, high-risk countries, which were high risk from the start, right? China entered these countries knowing about those risks. That a couple of those countries, 24 maybe, are in deep financial difficulties, also as a result of China's lending, so face problems in paying back. And capital flows or lending through the Belt and Road has gone down. It's not so clear it has really collapsed. The problem we're talking about the Belt and Road and the prospects at the current stage is that we really know so little, especially on a detailed level. So China is not giving out detailed data on what's going on the projects, on where it lends and what it does exactly on the contracts. And that makes it very hard to make kind of these real-time assessments. An ongoing report by Data, which will come out this week or next week, is actually coming to the conclusion that the volumes haven't gone down as much as some of the recent press coverage has suggested. So in that sense, you know, maybe the bust isn't as deep as we thought, but there certainly is a hiccup. So in short, kind of the love story is a little bit over, but we are entering a new phase, which indeed has somewhat of a different focus, will be greener, but I don't expect this project to end anytime soon. And it's a long game that China is playing here. It's a very long-term commitment. So I think we will have plenty more panelist discussions in the next 10 years on the Belt and Road. So we will have another. That's why, you know, emphasizing along the Belt and Road, we'll probably see much more of it.
Well, thank you. We don't have, unfortunately, 10 years to discuss in this composition, but maybe I will actually turn to my other question and also ask Alicia and Stefan to come in, because we talk so much about these Belt and Road projects. They are often somehow contentious as well, but is actually and we focus now first on the economic impact and then later on the political impact, but is the economic footprint of these projects really in line with the attention that these projects often receive? Or in other words, how important are the Belt and Road Initiative projects to the countries who are receiving them? And maybe you can connect a little bit with the debt implications for those countries. And I don't know who wants to go first, but or can I? Yeah, ladies first.
Okay, thank you. So I would start by saying that the projects are very different. I think some are indeed very relevant for the economies at large, others are not. And some are important because they're strategic, yeah? So to start, I mean, we see many, many projects, but when we look at what I call the old BRI, because I agree with Christian that this has evolved enormously from, to me, basically a connectivity project. And this is the first summit of the BRI, very clearly. It was trade connectivity, investment, people-to-people connectivity, finance connectivity. That's how it was designed at the time. I think the infrastructure part is waning because the amount of investment needed is very large, and not only from China but also from the host countries. Part of the debt that the example of Sri Lanka is very telling. People say, China's debt is only 10% of the total. Yes, but a lot of the debt raised was to finance those projects from the Sri Lankan part. So a lot of that can't happen anymore. These countries are too indebted, and I don't think China has the financial muscle to continue. But the key now is actually foreign policy and security.
I think we'll come to this.
Exactly, and that requires different projects. And in fact, if you look at the biggest amount of money spent in China, and I finish here, is Russia and Pakistan. That's the bulk of it. It's about 60 billion, 40 billion, in essence. We can look at the details. That's the bulk of the money spent, and these are security projects. Yeah, what are the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, part of Siberia 1. I mean, all of these are security projects. So we have to, in a way, change a little bit what we were expecting and realize that what we have is probably what was meant. And, and we just have to forget maybe a lot of that trade connectivity that might not have been the biggest, except for, of course, railway into Europe. Yeah.
Thank you. Stefan, would you agree that it has changed quite a lot qualitatively from this connectivity aspect to other aspects? And how big is the economic importance of these projects?
I would say that according to country groups, there's a difference of type of projects. Mergers and acquisitions are more important in advanced economies for obvious reasons. The relatively large size of these markets is, of course, also attractive for Chinese enterprises. That also supports mergers and acquisitions. As is possibly coveted technology that may be acquired by taking over target firms. That is much more difficult now because of the deterioration of political relations and the screening of Chinese investors. Yet access to Western markets has recently become more difficult due to these reasons. That said, in some areas, China may have not reached the top, but some areas like semiconductors, artificial intelligence, just recently there was a breakthrough in semiconductors with Huawei, I think, using a new phone. Robotics and digital technologies, China has in recent years apparently managed to reduce its dependence on Western technologies. On the other hand, infrastructure is much less developed in developing countries. Therefore, greenfield investments may be more attractive in the latter or continue to be more attractive, but a smaller size because so much money has already been spent, and we have the debt problem also. So much the more given that infrastructure building is often seen also by host country authorities, we may not speak enough about them because they are the ones that are often interested in these projects and come forward. They may not receive finance from the World Bank or from other sources, but then they receive finance from China, and sometimes it works out.
We will come to this in the next round, because I think there could be different views also on this, whether they have access to the finance or whether it's the way how the access would work that is the obstacle.
Perhaps just 5 points. We have spoken of concrete projects.
I want to give Christoph a chance as well. But
No, just concrete projects that have, because it's so old, the initiative is 10 years old already. There are a number of large projects that have been realized that have been relatively successful. For example, the Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railroad. I haven't heard of much complaints about that. The Tashkent-Fergana direct rail link in Uzbekistan. The Gwadar deep sea harbor and airport, Pakistan. The Mombasa-Nairobi express railroad. I haven't heard much complaints about that. The modernization of the port of Piraeus has been quite profitable. The power of Siberia gas pipeline, Russia, China. The just finished hyper-modern Kunming-Vientiane high-speed rail link. The Yamal LNG project in Russia, just finished in May of this year. The Jakarta-Bandung bullet train that was inaugurated by the president of Indonesia in September. And the Arctic LNG 2 project in Russia that was just opened in July this year. So I haven't heard much complaints about those. They're huge projects.
Thank you also for this long list of successful projects. So overall, I understand rather you see that there are actually quite some positive economic impacts from this initiative. Christoph, would you agree with that?
Yes, definitely. I mean, this has been it would be depressing if a 1 trillion investment and a lending project wouldn't at least generate a couple of dozen highly successful projects. So this is certainly a very important. This has been transformative in not so few countries. It's brought growth. There's evidence on this. It's brought well-being. There's many other examples with less success. But at the moment, I mean, if you think of it in a bigger picture, I guess there's two things. I mean, in the short-run financial returns of the Belt and Road for China itself, it's very hard to judge whether it turned out profitable or not. Overall, I would say the signals are that it probably is too early to tell, but one should keep in mind, despite all the debt problems that these countries have, they are still paying back, right? The net flows have turned around. So now that China has become a debt collector. And this means that, basically you're being paid back the financial returns on this. We don't know enough on the returns on the individual projects from an equity side. One should not forget that China and many of these countries is not only a lender, but also an investor, right? It holds de facto, or state companies hold stakes in these companies. So to judge whether it was a success for China, one would need more data. But that's a smaller, kind of more focused economic return or success assessment. The bigger is, I mean, what did it achieve overall? Well, I think it did very well, because this very conference shows how China has broadened its influence around the world. Everybody's talking about it. When I started my PhD on sovereign debt crisis, China was not even in a footnote. Now it's a title page, right? You cannot solve a single debt crisis without China. It's everywhere. And the influence of the United States, for example, in the 1980s was pretty high when they were managing the debt crisis of the developing countries. So creditors to countries in debt distress are very powerful, right? So China has not only gained on the whole investment, lending, and project side, but also in terms of just global power. Again, on the bigger picture, the jury is still out on the reputational side, right? We don't know whether ultimately this will be a reputational boon, or whether the cost of this, of all the kind of fallout and the debt fallout will be so high that it kind of muddies the waters on all the positive signs from the Belt and Road. But overall, I think if you think that the US spent $6 to $7 trillion on the war on terror, on the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and China paid $1 trillion on the Belt and Road, I think the success in global influence is clearly the returns on influence, if you want, is clearly on China's side when we look at the last 20 years.
Thank you, Christoph. Actually, I would like to turn more to this global influence, political influence, and from a multipolar point of view. And we have already quite some views collected here on the panel, but if you go out on the internet, you get even a broader diversity of views. And I have come across a voice from the internet, as I said, from the BRICS Institute in Sweden, the Belt and Road Institute, and one of its co-founders and current vice president, Hussein Askari, has, and I would just like to quote him, maybe I can ask our technician to give us a very brief video. It's 50 seconds. So and then I will continue and ask you for your reactions on this.
And that's why all these political projects, I call them political projects because there's no substance and reality for these global gateway, build back better world, global infrastructure partnership strategy, blah, blah, blah. There is no substance because the politicians who present them, they know nothing about economics. They know very little about geography. President Biden in the G20 summit, he also talked about another project. He said, we will connect Africa from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, from Angola to Zambia to Tanzania with a railway. I said, wait a minute, that was already built by China.
So I know it's a bit provocative, but I think it illustrates maybe one issue we might have, that just Chinese investments respond much faster to infrastructure needs than funding through international financial institutions, bodies like the EU. But on the other hand, as we have also heard, they are less transparent. They undercut social and labor standards in constructions. So how should official lenders, such as development banks or the EU or the US, react actually to this? Does the response from the West come too late? Is it too little? Do we spend enough funds? Do we offer the right or the wrong incentives? Maybe you give it a start, Stefan, but okay. Please 3 minutes, because we want to have time also for general questions. So each of you gets 3 minutes now.
Okay. Well, thank you, Julia. It's a very interesting, very stark presentation that you showed here. I'd say that the Chinese investors, they do not only respond faster, but they may also be more competitive, at least in some cases. After all, in the last 10 years, Chinese firms accumulated a wealth of experience, and a number of large infrastructure projects across the globe appear to have been successfully finished. Not all, but a number of large ones. Also, with rail links still being very important in the framework of Belt and Road projects. And a speaker yesterday in our audience drastically referred to that. It is well known that the Chinese high-speed rail network is as large or even larger than all other high-speed rail networks of the world taken together. Now, if that kind of experience and performance doesn't boost Chinese firms' competitiveness, I don't know what will. And doubtlessly, labor and social standards should be respected, that's clear. Efforts in this respect are being made, for example, by recently created IFIs, the IFIs, that of course strive to establish good track records, like the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, or the new development bank of the recently expanded BRICS group. It's called now BRICS Plus. In any case, the existence of new Western infrastructure initiatives, for example, the Program of Growth of Infrastructure and Investment, the PGII, since June 2022, and the Global Gateway since December 2021, is a good thing as such, because it gives host countries a choice. In some cases, however, like the aimed for establishment, it recently was a lot in the press, the aimed for establishment of the so-called Lobito corridor, the main plank of the PGII now, if I understand it correctly, the Lobito corridor, a strategic metal transport corridor from the heart of Africa to the Atlantic coast. There are already Chinese firms developing infrastructure connectivity projects in the countries concerned, namely Zambia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Angola. And in such cases, it might be preferable to establish trilateral cooperation with the host countries and with firms on the ground before making declarations that may be too strongly worded.
Well, thank you. And Christoph, would you agree with this rather positive evaluation of BRI projects?
So, I just not to repeat myself. I think I was preparing for an answer on kind of the West's response.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry.
I kind of think that overall, as I said, narrowly speaking, it's probably too early to tell whether it's a big financial success, but in the bigger picture, I think in terms of global influence, it is a big success for China. For the countries itself, again, mixed bag. But what should the West do? The West, I think, the moment risks copying the kind of last period or the last period of the Belt and Road, the old Belt and Road, if you want, right? It risks copying the infrastructure, what Alicia very nicely emphasized, the connectivity, infrastructure, finance part of it. But the Belt and Road is not anymore, has never been only an infrastructure project. It's a project really about also global influence, about putting China at the center of the global economic and political system. And I agree with Alicia that security has become more important. I disagree that it hasn't been important before that, right? That I think China has always thought security along all these projects. Some of them were not security projects, but many of them you can interpret even as helping China potentially deal with a conflict better, to be better prepared for autarky or for sanctions, right? So all these connecting with raw material exporters. The infrastructure is always also dual use, military and civilian. So the West should do two things. One, it should put money on the table, real money, and not just money for conferences talking about money. Second, I agree with Alicia, the emphasis on security, right? We should think that through. We should, we're not talking about military aid, but we should be very well aware that security has to be thought as a side part pretty much on all of these new initiatives. So a geoeconomic view on any new project, not just focused on infrastructure in a narrow sense, but thinking, security plus economics is the second part. So it has to win back by putting money on the table, and it should emphasize on the geoeconomic side of any such initiative.
Thank you. So we need more money. Any other things that the West can do, Alicia?
I think we have money. So to start, we are not deploying our money. China is not the largest creditor in the world. We are. I don't know whether people realize this, because what I am really astonished is how well China plays its narrative. I just can't believe that probably in this audience, everybody thinks China is the largest creditor in the world. I can't believe how China manages to do this. It's just so good. I mean, I wish I could learn, because it is astonishing to me that we, Europeans, largest creditors in the world, whether it's banking, finance, where it's actually FDI, stock of FDI. It's certainly not China.
You mean Germany is the largest? What do you mean? Which country is the largest?
The whole of the EU. The whole of the EU. We can discuss whether it's only Germany or somebody else, but to me it doesn't really matter. It is not China.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Secondly, on many of the projects that you mentioned, I could give you a list of others that have gone nowhere. But most importantly is that those projects are, hub and spoke. Hub and spoke means many spokes, one hub. These are not regional projects. Think about what are, and again, the economic corridor that China has built. What is that for? To avoid the Strait of Hormuz. That's what it is for.
So strategic consideration.
Of course. How much can Pakistan, how much Pakistan will benefit? It depends on whether, as Christian was saying, China will be in a position that it needs to avoid the Strait of Hormuz. Then Pakistan will benefit. But it's hub and spoke, it's not regional, and it serves a purpose. And that means, and a little bit more publicity, and I finish here. We ran this paper, again, it's somewhere at Bruegel, and hopefully ICA will get it out somewhere else, on the sentiment of the BRI in the world. Well, it's mind-boggling. If it's so successful, why has the sentiment been plummeting? I realized because, this paper was quoted on the white paper of the third summit, BRI summit in Beijing. And I was like, wow, how can this be quoted? Because, sentiment is plummeting. Of course, the average across the years is positive. So that was quoted. But the reality is, and I say it loud and clear, is that the sentiment has plummeted across host countries. And this is not only non-BRI, us, but BRI countries as well. So, and why? Because I think at the end of the day, yes, I'm sure it has a huge return across the years. But whether it is for the host countries' return, that's a big issue. Some will benefit. Russia will benefit because there's no other choice. But would have China benefited in a Russia benefited in a different global environment? Maybe not. Because the gas that Russia was selling through part of Siberia 1 before Ukraine was already much cheaper than the gas that Russia was selling to us. So, is that a benefit? So, I feel like I wish I could learn this narrative, because if we Europeans could learn this narrative, probably we would not be having this discussion. But we're not good at this word. And by the way, I end up saying that video, the first problem is that, as Christian was saying, we're imitating China. Why would Biden have to say what project people will build? This is a private sector thing. This is why our project should be better, because they are decided by private needs. And we are imitating China. This is the problem. I feel that we're just doing what probably we're least suited to do.
So your answer is that the West should do something new. That's what it is.
Absolutely.
I think there are many more questions
infrastructure
from
is
the
also
floor.
public,
Excuse
not
me,
private.
Stefan, but we have a very engaged audience, and I see our governor who has raised his hand. So please, can he have a micro? Then Franz, and if there are more questions, take your time. Yeah, Kurt and Julia, and then we close. Give the panelists a chance, please.
Thank you, very much for this fascinating discussion. Just a few comments. I think to the point Alicia mentioned, I think what we have is China, in this case, is highly centralized. It's not the provinces in charge, it's a central part. What we have in Europe, on the other side, we have on the European Commission working in a highly uncoordinated manner in countries. In addition, you have the individual countries getting engaged. So there's no general strategy how to deal with infrastructure and how we deal with development. It's a cacophony, and unless this is solved, we will have the same part of it. Okay. Second part, in the same vein, we have the lack of communication, as you said. We have communications from so many countries. We have a communication and non-communication from the part of the European Union, and we have the same problem again. Point 3 and 4, it's more a question, because I see a lot of strategy, as you mentioned, but what also Christopher mentioned, with regard how investment are done. But apparently, it's not all the same way. So for me, for example, financing this motorway in Montenegro, or financing the railroad between Serbia and Hungary, sounds to me a pretty strange idea to really one who brought it. On the other hand, having brought up the port of Athens by Costco, I was there a week ago and looked at it. This makes a lot of sense. So I see a lot of sometimes or some inconsistency. And the last part where still a bit puzzled is the assessment about the debt problems created by China's lending and how to deal with it, because what we heard here, Stefan, is it sounded pretty benign. Oh, they were generous now coming in, there were problems to be solved. And we had recently here in Vienna Carmen Reinhardt, and I know that Christopher wrote some of the papers with her, and she gave a totally different picture, that the way how the resources come in were pretty ad hoc and not in the way we normally would do with a debtor. It was more something providing liquidity, but not support. So if perhaps Christoph could provide or others provide some additional information. Thank you.
Thank you. While the micro goes to Franz, maybe Christoph, you want to, since you've been mentioned here, answer briefly?
Sure. I don't want to get across the impression that these debt problems are not massive. They are, right? I mean, I spoke of 2 to 3 dozen countries, low-income countries, that are now in debt distress or in a debt crisis, partly as a result of China's lending boom. So China's lending was as so many earlier lending booms, ended in a bust in these countries, and in a crisis, ended in unemployment, bankruptcies, fiscal crisis, right? So in these countries, and the big problem is that we might see a repeat of the 1980s here, right? We might see another lost decades in those low-income countries, because I don't see any signs that China is willing to write down the debts soon, or to forgive a lot of these loans. So we will, just like BRI conferences, we will see many more conferences on how to resolve the developing country debt crisis and how to resolve the China debt crisis problem, all right? So this will stick with us, just like as during the 1980s debt crisis, it took 15 years to clean up. The 1920s war debts took 15 years to clean up. So the chances are that this will take another 10-something years, with all the negative consequences that has. So I don't want to, but in a bigger picture from a Chinese perspective, you know, those funds are not large. These are small, high-risk countries. And I was speaking more from a, you know, Chinese perspective. From a developing country perspective, it's a mixed bag. You know, all these debt trouble countries, they made a pretty bad deal overall, I think.
Thank you. Just a quick question. Do we have questions from the internet? No. Okay. Then Franz, please be very brief, because we could...
Shortly following up on what was requested, the problem is with over-indebted developing countries, they need a haircut on their debt before we can have an IMF program, or before we can have multilateral financing. And so the problem will be, if China will not agree to a haircut, it will be very difficult to get an IMF program. So we are in the worst situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Franz. And we will just abuse our position as being before the break, because we could please just here, and Julia, and just you know, brief question, and then the last round.
Thank you. I refer to the same debt problem. Stefan was very, I think, optimistic in saying China is so generous to help these countries, but China refuses to join the international efforts for debt restructuring. And so I wonder, Alicia, when you say Europe should join a partnership with China, can that be successful? China is not a very credible partnership partner if it doesn't have really its own saying. You know, in the New Development Bank, China has, just like the US in the World Bank, a blocking minority, share and so on. And they really are very strategic in where they apply their cooperative efforts. Thanks.
Thank you. Just hand on next to you.
I'm sorry for breaking that nice flow on the questions of the debt crisis. This one is not related to that one. So it was in September this year that the public forum took place at the World Trade Organization, and there was also a session on critical raw materials for strategic sectors and for green transition, and also with representatives from China. And they were acknowledging that they are in fact exporting 90 to 100% of the raw materials partially for specific raw materials, but they also said that they were dependent on quite some of these raw materials. So my question to the panelists is, do you see somehow in the investments or in the BRI projects that there is a shift towards these economies where China is more dependent on these raw materials? Thank you.
Thank you. So we have two issues here, the debt issue and this reliance on raw materials. And I ask you for very, very brief answers. And who wants to start? Please, Alicia.
Yes, I'll only take the partnership because I think I'm the only one that can answer that question. And it is a great question because I was not clear. Our partnership does not include China. And maybe I should have said that loud and clear. For a very simple reason, you cannot create a partnership to the risk and include the risking force into the partnership. And our proposal is exactly to have two, at least, but help create a new supply chain. And this brings me to the question on critical raw materials, where you actually have access to other sources of critical raw materials, which would make, and this is not, sorry, what I was trying to say, and maybe that's the confusion, to exclude China and never rely on that supply chain is to create an alternative, supplementary, to have, to reduce the technological path dependence, and to make sure that there is a spare wheel. You call it double wheel, spare wheel, you can call it as you like, depending on who you are, which country you are. But the whole idea was to create a partnership which in a way creates an additional, put it this way, not an alternative and nothing else, supply chain. And that's the idea of our partnership.
Thank you for clarifying this point.
Yes.
So we will have a denser woven net of
Yes.
relationships. Stefan, please, 1 minute.
Thank you very much. I have been asked, I have referred to lots of issues. I would just quickly like to go through. Alicia, we spoke about infrastructure. Infrastructure is important, and infrastructure is not a private good. It's a semi-private public good. So very often you need public-private partnerships, and only the private sector in infrastructure will not be enough. The other thing is the popularity of China or the Belt and Road Initiative. I don't have the most recent data, but in 2022 there was an economist poll across Africa, and here China was much more popular than the United States. That's according to the Economist. Yeah. Then we also have how does this chime with the development of the BRICS Plus, for example? If China was so unpopular, China is the most important economy of the BRICS. Some say it's sort of leading the BRICS. If that was the case, why was there such an expansion of BRICS? And why did the term Global South evolve, actually? We have that now for a year, that term. So, yeah. How do we come to the term Global South? We have that for a year right now, if China is so unpopular. Then the debt problem, that's not my specialization, that's not my topic.
Okay, so maybe we can turn to...
one last point to Mr. Governor, concerning the Piraeus, that Piraeus is okay, and the two projects you mentioned, financing the Serbia-Hungary, the Budapest-Belgrade high-speed rail connection, and the Bar-Belgrade highway, the connection between Montenegro and Belgrade. I think that in the Chinese conception that fits together, because you have a direct access from Athens via Belgrade to Budapest. That is the so-called land-sea express route, as the Chinese say. And you have a branch from that going off to Montenegro, connecting Montenegro to the hub of the Western Balkans, namely the major economic center, namely Belgrade. So that brings these things together. But I agree that connection, that connectivity project is encountering very many obstacles, and it is far away, and it's not clear whether it would ever really be realized. But that's the idea behind to have this connection to Central Europe, and then on from Central Europe to core Europe.
Thank you. And we give the last word to Christoph, maybe on the debt issue, because that has not probably been received enough attention.
Yes, so I'm not optimistic that China will deliver the haircuts that were mentioned in the audience. There is no incentive for China to do so. There's no will to do so, and why should they, right? I mean, in the 1980s, when it was the US's turn of having lent too much and being facing many debtor countries in distress, you could have met 500 times with Citibank, and they wouldn't have forgiven the debt. And now we're meeting 500 times with CDB or Exim Bank, and they will not forgive the debt. They have little incentive. The way they are running this is perfectly fine. I mean, their returns are pretty high despite the distress. The restructuring they do is just pushing out the can down the road. They are doing exactly what the US, the Paris Club has been doing in the 80s, and this game will go on for another 10 years. I don't expect the common framework to suddenly transform into a successful initiative. I'm just not, it's the best we have. I can see the hope that Western policymakers put on the initiative, but I don't see the incentives right. One has to bribe China in doing that, and the question is if that's well invested money, right? I mean, de facto now they are senior. They get a much better deal out of these countries. They get money out of countries where they are defaulting on everybody else, or on at least 2 Western countries. So why should they change a winning system from their perspective? The only reason they could shift is just global opinion, right? The US has been pretty successful with this debt trap diplomacy story, or
so there is a competing narrative.
Pitch,
I hope
right?
that there is some comfort to Alicia. Thank you so much. We have now more than abused our time. I'm sorry, I wanted to just run over 5 minutes. It has become 9 minutes. So looking at Ingrid, can we just shift so that we have a 30-minute break here? Okay, then I announce that we will make a 30-minute break to give you also time for networking, having a bit of a refreshment, and we will start the next panel at 15:25 then. So we are running 10 minutes late now in schedule. I apologize for that, but it was a very rich discussion. I thank you, my panelists, also Alicia, for staying with us. A big hand, please, to my panelists, and have a nice evening.
Okay. Does this whataboutism sound familiar to you? Why should we introduce more ambitious climate policies? Our country's emissions are so small compared to China's. So they should start. Does it sound familiar to you? Political economists would call this as an expression of the collective action problem. We are talking here about the elephant and the mice in the room. Sorry. So welcome to the next session of this conference. Our topic is financing the green transition, cooperation between China and Europe. Can China save the world, or is it rather part of the problem? China contributes to almost 1/3 of all global greenhouse gas emissions, about twice as much as the United States, and 4 times as much as the EU. Calculated per capita, however, the comparison would turn on its head, even before considering historical or exported emissions. Still, Chinese coal-fired power plants account for about half of the global capacity. Contrary to the usual perception, however, China has an ambitious emission target, peak by 2030 and net zero by 2060. And it tends to overachieve. It is a global leader in both making and using solar and wind energy, as well as batteries and electric vehicles. Yet China must move further from high speed to high quality and low carbon growth. Without China, and I think after this conference this has already been clear to you, the world will not tackle climate change. The EU, however, with its Green Deal, is clearly leading global climate action. But how dependent is Europe's low carbon transition on inputs from China? And what to do about this? Central, Eastern and Southeastern Europe has converged substantially to EU averages with respect to carbon intensity. Can China accelerate green transition in CESEE countries? And to what extent does geopolitical rivalry hamper this? What opinions for mutual beneficial green tech transfers do we have? And what to learn from China's wide-ranging approach to green finance? These are some of the questions we are going to talk for the next about hour or so. And let me welcome our two distinguished speakers here in the panel, Xiaodong Wang, I hope I pronounced it correctly, from the World Bank, and Nico Korpa from the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. In the program, you also see a third speaker, Ma Jun, of the China Society of Finance and Banking. Unfortunately, he cannot participate today, but he sent us a video, and we will start with showing this video. Because it is a good summary of the Chinese position on these issues. Without exaggeration, Dr. Ma Jun can be called China's Mr. Green Finance. Currently, he chairs the Green Finance Committee in the China Society for Finance and Banking, the Institute of Finance and Sustainability, and the G20 Sustainable Finance Study Group. Before, he worked in a lot of positions, including as a member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the People's Bank of China and as a chairman of the Regulatory Working Group on Global Central Bankers of the Global Central Bankers Network for Greening the Financial System, the NGFS. By the way, China was one of the founding members of this system, of this network. And in the People's Bank of China, Ma Jun led the drafting of the guidance for green finance in China. And by the way, he also served as at the World Bank and the IMF. So let us start with the video now, please.
Let me start by thanking Austria Central Bank and Bank of Finland Institute for inviting me to join this important conversation. I have been a macroeconomist for past 3 decades and served as chief economist at the PBOC or the Chinese Central Bank for some years. But over the past 10 years, I spent most of my time working on green finance, climate change, and international cooperation in related areas, and served as a co-chair for the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group for a few years until early this year. So from my perspective, I would say a few words on China's position as a global manufacturing base and its role in helping reduce inflation globally and helping the global economy to achieve carbon neutrality at the lower costs. In the last 10 years, China has become the largest producer of renewable energy. For example, last year, the Chinese new installation of renewable energy capacity accounted for 52% of global total. China is also now the largest producer of electric vehicles and the largest producer of batteries, which is key to the EV industry and energy storage. The total number of electric vehicles running in China now accounts for over 50% of global total. And in the first 7 months of this year, China sold over 4 million electric vehicles, accounting for 62% of global total sales. China also became the largest exporter of electric vehicles in the world. In the renewable equipment space, China's solar equipment production is now 70% of global total supply, and the Chinese wind equipment production is about 50% of a global total. From economics perspective, I think China's strong position in green manufacturing largely reflects the fact that China itself is the largest buyer because we have 1.4 billion people, which resulted in a very significant benefit of economy of scale in the form of lower unit cost for production. Of course, the competitiveness also came from the Chinese industries investing a large amount of money in R&D in the past 10 years, which certainly helped to raise the total factor productivity. I should also refer to the reason of a more complete ecosystem for manufacturing, which allows Chinese producers to source materials and other inputs more cheaply than other jurisdictions. What do these facts mean to other countries and the global decarbonization agenda? I would offer a couple of observations. Number one, if one country produces the same goods at higher costs for whatever reason, from the consumer welfare perspective, I think it should keep its market open and allow import of these goods from other countries that can produce more cheaply. This openness can help reduce its inflation in the importing country and improve its consumer welfare. Its consumers can spend less on import goods and use the saved money to buy something else. My point number two, for geopolitical reasons, some politicians may be concerned about supply chain resilience or stability. Then the question is whether the perceived geopolitical risk is calculated correctly or not. If the risk is exaggerated and the exaggerated risk is becoming a reason for closing the market for many goods and services, then the victims will be domestic consumers, and they will have to pay high prices for these goods and services. Let me give you one analogy in the field of finance. If a pension fund manager is overly risk averse, and based on this incorrect calculation of risk, he or she shifts its entire portfolio towards fixed income holding by excluding equity holding, then the consequence must be a decline of the portfolio's long-term financial performance. My third point is that between China and Europe, I think we should not only allow free trade, but should also appreciate the great opportunity for collaboration in climate technologies. By climate technology, I mean not only technology related to renewables, electric vehicles, and batteries, but also technology that can help decarbonize industries, such as steel, cement, petrochemical, and agriculture. Many European countries started working on these technologies earlier than China, but due to relatively small market size, these technologies may not become economically viable in some European countries in the near term. If China and Europe are collaborating in the form of JV or something else, then the chance of them becoming successful in the short term will be higher, because cost of R&D and production could be lower and the market is bigger. This collaboration will speed up the development of the technologies and will eventually help produce lower cost green tech products for the rest of the world, especially for other emerging markets, therefore help speeding up the process of global decarbonization. If each of us is working to produce these technologies in silo, we can still do it, but it takes longer to achieve success, i.e. the world will take longer to produce enough low-cost green technologies. And therefore, I would say a siloed approach will only delay the world's progress towards carbon neutrality. Let me stop here and thanks the organizers once again for inviting me to join this discussion, and I wish today's conference a great success. Thank you.
So yeah, I think a good start and a direct voice from China directly. And now let me briefly introduce our next speaker, Xiaodong Wang. She's lead energy specialist in the World Bank. And I think you're now starting to work as leading the infrastructure program for China and Mongolia. And before that, you led the India's energy program of the World Bank. Dr. Wang has more than 20 years of experience of operational experience in energy transition and clean energy programs in more than 20 developing countries. She co-authored the report China Country Climate and Development Report, among other relevant flagship studies of the World Bank and other institutions. Prior to the World Bank, Xiandong managed to the climate change and sustainable energy program at the UN Foundation and worked at the United Nations Development Program. Xiandong, the floor is yours. You start here, you have a click. I think everything should be prepared well, and let's enter it.
Okay. Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yeah. Well, thank you very much. First of all, I really like to thank the organizer to invite me to this workshop. And yeah, so I have been leading the energy transition program at the World Bank, working almost all the coal-dominated economies. So right now I'm in India, but now I'm in a transition going back to China. So today I will talk about 4 areas. One is to first to set the stage, talk about the tale of 2 Chinas. I think already mentioned that China is on the one hand the largest emitter and coal consumer, but on the other hand the leader in clean energy. And then going to the decarbonization pathway, how China going to reach net zero by 2060. And then I'm going to talk about at the World Bank side, what we have been doing on the green financing side to support the energy transition in China. And finally, I will go to very briefly about the China dominance in the supply chain. I think then Nico will expand on that. So I think already mentioned that China emits more CO2 than the US and EU combined and burn more coal than the rest of the world combined. But on the other hand, China is also installing more solar and wind than the rest of the world combined. The solar and wind capacity reach more than 800 gigawatt now. So China is on track to achieve the NDC target 5 years ahead of time. Not just on renewable energy, on the energy efficiency side, energy savings in China also counted more than half of the global achievement. And China's energy emission pretty much decoupled from the growth. And going forward, the challenge for China's transition is that if you look at the graphics on the left, compared to the developed economies in the US and UK and Japan, and China needs transition at a much lower income level at a much faster rate. The China's coal story is more complicated. I know that the Western world focuses so much on coal power, but actually half of the coal in China go to the power sector. The other half actually going to the industry and residential sector. The good news is the second half, the industry residential sector coal consumption has been declining because of the air pollution control efforts. But on the coal power side, the power capacity and power generation from coal has been increasing. So the overall effect, actually total coal consumption pretty much steady plateaued since 2015. But the bad news is over the last 2 years has been we see a relapse, no? We saw a bounce back slightly, mainly driven by the power shortage a few years ago, and then this war, this Russia's war and the gas energy security concerns driven that. But the coal share in the primary energy mix has been steadily decreased by 1 percentage point each year. And the power sector, the bulk of the incremental power supply has been coming from the renewable energy. Now, China is committed to peaking emission by 2030 and net zero by 2060, and also reduce the carbon intensity, and increase the non-fossil fuel in the primary energy mix from the current about 15% in 2020 to 25% in 2030. And the solar and wind capacity 1,200 gigawatt by 2030. This is what I mentioned. Right now it's about 800, so this will be achieved by 2025. So there is a technical decarbonization pathway to get net zero. Basically, first is to manage the demand side. On the supply side, the first step is to electrify the end user sectors, the transport industry, and decarbonize the power sector. I think the most challenging part is to really decarbonize the industry sector, since China produces half of the global iron, steel, and cement, and these are really notoriously hard to abate sectors. And this coal transition has been really, really hard. Economically, reaching net zero is also feasible. Our recent World Bank Climate Change Development Report in China estimate about $14 billion for the incremental cost just in the power and transport sector alone from now to 2060. That's equivalent to about 1% of GDP. Now, going into by each sector, in the power sector, reaching renewable target has been going actually faster than expected. So going forward, the real challenge is really how to integrate such a high share and penetration of renewable into the grid. And so we have been supporting and called for deepening the power sector reform in China. Because when you integrate renewable into the grid, first of all, China's power mix is dominated by coal. And the coal need to increase its flexibility. And now China's coal have this we call generation quota, meaning the coal power pricing is determined by the operating hours. So when the wind comes at night, the coal power producer didn't want to reduce the coal, not because it can't, but because it's going to lose money. So I've been working on this completely phase out this quota for coal generation. China has been gradually phasing out, but we need to completely phase out this quota, so make the coal become peaking, rather than mainstream baseload. So that's important. And energy storage is the next big game changer for grid integration. And China need to do the ancillary service market to compensate for energy storage service. And also the interregional trade and dispatch rules to make sure that dispatch renewable first. So these are really important to make sure renewable can be integrated to the grid. For the industry sector, in the short term, it's more about energy efficiency, electrification, but this will not be enough to achieve the net zero. So the green hydrogen, CCS, at least advanced technology, have to come in a big time after 2030, particularly for the iron, steel, and also the cement industry for CCS. On the energy efficiency, I want to say a few words. In the past few decades, the dramatic decline of energy intensity in China, about 80% is from the economic structure change away from heavy industries, and 20% is the technical efficiency improvement. So the structure change is a huge part of the agenda. For the transport sector, I know everybody's talking about EV in China, and Chinese think they can just resolve the problem from EV. But we kind of recommend a holistic approach to avoid shift and improve. And particularly in terms of the integrated transit-oriented development to avoid the need to travel and to shift to public transport, particularly improving the interconnection of the mode. This coal transition has been really difficult. So we have been working, for example, one of the coal provinces, in Shanxi province in China. They produce more coal than entire India. And we found this coal transition being hugely difficult because, first of all, there are millions and millions workers working in this industry. I used to work in Poland. I know that the union is very strong there, and there was 80,000 coal miners. And here we have 6 million. So it's a completely different order of magnitude. And this decarbonization could result in just 1 to 2 million coal workers job loss by 2030. So it's a huge impact. And how to mitigate this impact on people and community is critically important, not just on the social safety net, but also reskilling and retraining. And that has a close link with economic transition, because in this backward coal region, they don't know anything else. And they always go back to coal as the engine to development. And also this land is also important that mitigate impact of coastal and transitional land. So that one China has been doing quite well. The largest floating solar in the world is in China, is one of the abandoned coal mine area. And some of the abandoned coal mine have the huge gigawatt solar park, I think has this panda-shaped solar park report in BBC as well. So let me talk a bit about the green financing. This session is about. So in my view, green financing is on the supply side because we have been, as a bank, right, for the World Bank, I mean, I know the previous session talked a lot about the MDB, about these rules. We have been setting up a financing facility for clean energy country after country. And it's very clear if you don't have a conducive policy, the market pool, and our money just sitting there, have no disbursement. So it's really important to have this conducive policy to drive the financing. So in China, on the energy efficiency field, the government has been taking more administrative measures. They have the mandatory energy efficiency target, they allocate to the province, they allocate to the state enterprise. It basically is a stick. Now you have to achieve those, and with some financial support. And so what we have been doing at the World Bank is to introduce more market-based approach. So in the 90s, we introduced this energy service company ESCO approach and established the first 3. And then they start to flourish, and we provide a guarantee for this industry. And today, from 3 already increased about 7,000. It's about almost $20 billion business a year, about 60% of global ESCO market. And our guarantee also leveraged 7 times. That's primarily from the local financial institutions and local private sector. And moving forward, in the last decade, we provided a $400 million loan through the local banks. This is linked to what Marjun is saying, how we incentivize to the local banks to make their portfolio green, to mainstreaming this clean energy into their portfolio. And that's been hugely success. It leveraged about 8 times our funding. Total about $3 billion portfolio for energy efficiency into China market. So not only have a significant energy saving emission reduction, but also mainstreaming this green finance into this bank. So one of my client, the bank, for example, here we only provide $400 million. And one of my client bank now have a $20 billion green financing a year. So that's kind of mainstream effect, the kind of leverage we're talking about here. So again, you know, the reason we can achieve this kind of achievement is because the government, this whole demand, you know, this policy to put the market demand right there. And we have tried this approach in other countries, and some of them have mixed results. On the renewable energy side, a similar story. We have done this, we call the China Renewable Energy Scale Up CRESP program, phase 1 and phase 2. So when we started to help China with the renewable energy law with the feed-in tariff, we have just the first phase was way back in the 20s. We had a $40 million grant. It's a relatively modest amount of grant to help put the policy environment into place. And that leveraged China today become the biggest renewable energy market and biggest renewable energy investment in the world. So to see the policy can drive this investment, drive the green financing, that's my point. And when the China renewable energy start to increase, there was a huge problem about the feed-in tariff was too high, was about the cost, about the grid integration. So our phase 2 is really focused on cost reduction, change to auction approach, and change to grid integration. And now we work in the net zero. My last slide is really about China and Europe and the world. I know this has been a topic over the past 2 days, that you know, China's dominance in the clean energy supply chain. And Europe now have this net zero target by 2050 and ban all the internal combustion engine by 2035. And I know that, you know, the last 2 days was a lot to talk about, you know, Europe doesn't want to just want to reduce the risk, de-risk, you know, that's the word talk most about these 2 days. Now to reduce the reliance on China on this dominance of the supply chain. And you're not alone. I can tell you, I lived and worked in India for the past 3 years. And what India has done, I mean, Europe is not India, but what India has done, I think, have some lessons learned. So India also trying to build its own PV industry, trying not to rely on China. So at the first, they banned, the China PV thing as their provider, the least provider. So the result is that Indian PV development basically stopped last year. And there's a gigawatt backlog, right? The government approved, but there's no supply because they are domestic. It takes time for domestic manufacturing to come online. It takes time. So finally, government realized that they put a China supplier back, and then they put a 40% on the import duty. The result of that is that, first of all, renewable costs went up, way up, because India has doing really well because the auction now go down, solar has been cheaper than coal, and the clean can push out coal. That's the strategy. But now, because the solar is so much more expensive and massive coal buildings start to come online. And also for domestic manufacturing, because the purpose is to build a domestic manufacturing. But now the domestic manufacturing matching their cost for China plus 40%, right? Because that's the benchmarking of the market. So in our view, it doesn't really helping them to increase competitiveness of the local industry either. At least they should have a sunset clause. That's our recommendation. And now they're going to subsidize the green hydrogen production, which is 60% of the cost come from renewable, which now have the 40% import duty. So all this have implication for for India to get net zero, for example, or decarbonization at least. So again, I mean, Europe is a much better position in terms of manufacturing capacity, all of that. But there are some lessons learned. And the US, for example, I think everybody talking about this Inflation Reduction Act, pumping more than $400 billion and trying to play a catch-up game, right, to subsidize domestic manufacturing industry, trying to catch up. And we also see the analysis how US is output-based tax credit versus Europe subsidy for green hydrogen is more complicated, put that way. So there are lots of lessons learned, lots of reference, and it's not an easy answer to this dilemma. So I'll stop here. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Xiandong. It's now clear that everything is difficult, and to make it even more difficult, now Nico will put in the European perspective in this debate. But I mean, let me just mention that I've really found interesting that a bit in complementary to what Marjun has said, it's not only size that matters, it's also purpose. And it was interesting to hear that exactly the World Bank is so important, even in China, on this as a player with purpose. But let us now see whether the EU is also an important player on this.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation, and also to Ms. Wang and Marjun.
I'm sorry, I didn't introduce you.
Oh,
that's really something,
we can leave this out.
Nico Korper is, by the way, a senior consultant at Deloitte in Ljubljana and a part-time research associate at the WIIW, the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. His research focuses on international trade and policy, ecological economics, climate change, circular economy, as well as European policy and development. His consulting work focuses on climate and sustainability and covers issues such as sustainability reporting, sustainability strategy, development of low carbon investment, EU funding, and so on, which leads us then to the next session. So, but now you are, sorry for interrupting you once again.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm happy that you raised this dilemma, when companies ask what should we do if China is so vast. And in my consulting role, I get asked the same question that you asked today here. But of course, here it makes sense to talk about it, whereas if a client asks us, it's usually just to find an excuse not to do anything. So yeah, thanks again to the previous speakers who have already shown a great deal of empirical evidence, which gives a fantastic context to what I have planned to talk about, which is more focused on the way the policy focus of the EU has changed recently in light of EU-China trade relations, focusing, of course, mostly on green tech and raw materials. I will not talk so much about policies in depth, but rather about the motivations and the ideas and the narratives that have taken place. So a lot of them have been mentioned, the de-risking, strategic autonomy, diversification, some would say protectionism, for example, and so on. And of course, there is not much evidence yet of the effectiveness of these policies. So we will try to assess them critically a little bit, but of course the result is yet to be shown. And to begin, just to highlight this kind of great irony that we have today when there is more and more defensive approaches and rhetoric, while we have this issue of global climate change, which is of course borderless. On the left, a statement by Ursula von der Leyen when the Commission launched the investigation into alleged market distortions due to subsidies for electric vehicles in China, saying that Europe will act decisively when it finds evidence of unfair competition. On the right-hand side, condemnation of the carbon border adjustment mechanism by a Chinese representative, saying that it's regrettable and it could have serious implications for world trade and so on. So I would like to explore a little bit how we came to this situation, what has changed, and what can we expect in the future. Now, arguably, when there was an international focus of climate policy, and all climate policy has some form of international spillovers, of course, but when climate policy had an explicit international focus beforehand in the past 10, 15, 20 years, it mostly had to do with where emissions are produced. This story, of course, we know that richer countries are net importers of emissions, others are net exporters, China, of course, being the most prominent of them. And usually the focus was on addressing this issue of imported emissions and trying to pressure and incentivize trade partners to adopt stricter environmental standards. And because much of this focus was on energy-intensive industries, there is, of course, much talk of leveling the playing field and sort of protecting the European industry, right? And of course, China, I don't need to emphasize this, is the single most important supplier of imported emissions. And as world trade has grown, so has the amount and also share of imported emissions. And the way this got materialized in policy up until now, of course, we've seen attempts such as setting standards, for example, for cars with exhaust engines, which was a very influential measure. In fact, we've seen free trade agreements that have had some environmental provisions. The great I would say game changer in this regard, at least in terms of rhetoric, is the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which for those of you who are not familiar, basically imposes a tariff on certain products that are produced elsewhere and imported to the EU, so that the costs for foreign manufacturers are the same as for the domestic ones that are part of the European emissions trading system, right? So in effect, the Commission is directly imposing costs on exporters on environmental reasons, which is quite something that we haven't seen before in this form. But this is not the main focus of this presentation. I think that while this was happening, something more important has started to take place, namely that the green tech itself, this emerging economy, is now the subject of policy attention, right? And this is where all the talk about de-risking, diversification, and so on begins. I've listed some of the ways that this has materialized itself. It's not only through law, it's also through other actions, but we've seen the emergence of a return of a much more active state approach to industrial policy in the EU. But of course, this industrial policy has explicit aims which go beyond emissions reduction, right? And here, the story about security, supply chain risks, and so on comes in. And this is quite, I would say, a new development in terms of climate policy. The same can be said about the pursuit of more strategic autonomy in terms of raw materials. With this recent investigation, we see a more aggressive stance towards challenging some policy choices of key trade partners of the EU. And of course, the CBAM also covers hydrogen. So in this sense, it also touches upon the green economy. And what is new now is, of course, that there are goals on the desired level of production that the EU should achieve by 2030, and also goals on handling of critical raw resources, certain ones, of course, in terms of extraction, processing, recycling, and so on. Now, whether setting these goals is an optimal strategy, we can discuss. Many think it is not. But nevertheless, in many ways, this is, of course, a consequence of the dominance of China. And now I would like to expand on the reasons a little bit. I will not take long here. We've heard this before. China is, of course, the dominant producer of key technologies: wind turbines, solar panels, batteries, electric vehicles, and so on. And in this sense, this should also be said, China allows the EU to decarbonize itself. Yeah, just today or this week, there's a new report showing that the EU reduced emissions by 3% in 2022. That the capacity for solar has grown dramatically. I think above 30%, and this is of course due to imports of Chinese technology. Yeah? So in this sense, it's really a kind of symbiosis, it's not only a competition, right? But as we have heard, this concentration of manufacturing, the control over the ecosystem of the value chain of these key technologies has raised quite some concern, and some of the reasons are of course economic, who gets to reap the rewards of the green transition, but many of the crises that have happened in the past years have also given reason to doubt whether this is a good situation, right? So the supply chain issues, for example, where we talk mainly about de-risking, we've seen the problems that happened in the COVID crisis, the over-reliance on one country, which was also exposed after the breakout of the war in Ukraine, for example. And there is a fear, let's say, that this almost monopoly on certain materials and technologies could give space for a weaponization of this situation. And there are, of course, other domestic reasons, which are social and political. The importance of the car industry in Europe, of course, is well known. So the risk that there will be a great loss of jobs is itself enough reason to act. But just as well, the Green Deal agenda in Europe has been stalled somewhat. Several pieces of legislation have been watered down quite a bit. Just today there was news there are attempts to water down new regulation on vehicles and so on, and less than half has been implemented. And since we have a commission which is now slowly on its way out, I do believe there's some incentive to provide to sort of comply with the wishes of the industry in Europe and give some backing in terms of covered protectionism, so to say. The role of the USA, of course, extremely important, and we don't have time to go into that. But let's just say that there was real shock in the EU when the perceived partner, not a competitor, started to resort to active industrial policy, and there is, of course, all the third countries, which are both partners and sources of economic opportunity for Europe as well. And the unfortunate situation in some ways that we have now is one where the three main trade partners and the three main actors in the green transition express serious doubts into each other's policy choices, right? And we mentioned this, where the EU sees the Inflation Reduction Act as something that's potentially preventing European companies to access the American market, that potentially breaches WTO rules. See with mistrust China's very active stance on developing value chains in green tech. And at the same time, of course, some choices of the EU are also questioned the same way. The CBAM, we've seen the statement has been criticized as a kind of green protectionism and so on. And the danger of this situation is, of course, that it spirals into a series of retaliation, which in the end, in some way or other, impedes climate change efforts. And this is also the main source of criticism of this approach, which is namely that it misses the point, of course, and the previous speaker, Majun, has nicely argued for that as well, that from the standpoint of good green industrial policy, of course, having green products at low cost, which increases their uptake, is a good thing, right, and not a bad thing. Secondly, that it's questionable that such measures, which might lead to retaliation, are the best way to protect the interests of the European industry, which are, of course, valid. There's a good argument to be made that it's guided more so by political reasons and not by economic ones, and that it could hinder global cooperation on climate change. Whether this will happen, we will see. At the same time, the carbon border adjustment, which is something that my colleagues and I have done quite some research in, is, of course, an instrument which is, in my opinion, at least justifiable, but its ability to cause anger might be bigger than its ability to actually have a macroeconomic impact, because it covers so few products and so few sectors. So if you simulate the outcomes, they're actually quite small or relatively insignificant. And an argument can be made here that this sort of policy stance or direction acts as a smokescreen to some inherent weaknesses in the EU's approach to the green transition, which has to do with underfinancing, quite a lot of issues with climate finance in Europe, which I will not go into, and of course all the other structural issues in the EU that also the governor has mentioned before, problems with coordination, the lack of fiscal space, and so on. And also the issues of the private sector have less to do with Chinese success and more to do with the fact that European industry has been slow to react to the opportunity of electrification and alternative fuels engines. Yeah, so to conclude this part, it's even if the EU reaches the targets and manages to produce 40% of key technologies by 2030, which is questionable in itself, it's still obvious that it will require a great deal of imports coming from China. And as well, I had to leave the slide out because of time concerns, but there will also be space, of course, for exports to China. If all current projects get realized, there are simulations by the International Energy Agency that China will require a great deal of heat pumps, electrolyzers, and this is something where Europe can develop its own comparative advantages. But in light of this, yeah, it makes sense to have a sort of pragmatic approach and be more proactive in the domestics area, which is not to say, of course, that some diversification and de-risking is not a feasible opportunity. And just very quickly, a few ideas that come from different parts of literature on how to have a good, let's say, working relationship with China in the future. First, do not lose sight of the goal that the reduction of emissions should be the primary goal of industrial policy in the EU. Second, trying harder to understand the motivations for certain policy choices. I mentioned today that a lot of them also have to do, at least in the EU, with the domestic situation, with political reasons. I'm sure the same can be said about China. Third, being mindful of the fact that there will be disagreements due to different policy choices, and the challenge is how to find structures that allow us to reduce the risk of trade escalations, right? And some ideas on how this can be done are, for example, greater alignment of certain policies, such as the emission trading systems, establishing guardrails under the umbrella of the WTO. I saw an idea on having an agreement on green subsidies and so on. Fifth, I would add to that, the value chain cooperation is a very valuable way to transfer technology and good practices. And with the new legislation on sustainability reporting, for example, I believe there will be even more exchange of data, information, and good practices, and this can serve as a connecting factor. Last but not least, there is also an argument to be made that for the Commission, the issue is the location of manufacturing and not the ownership. So in this sense, developing mutual industrial collaborations, which do have some, which are placed at least partly in Europe, could be another way to strengthen this relationship. So I will end at this point and looking forward to the questions.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much, Nico. I mean, you made already difficult things. You explained that they are even more difficult, but you also put forward some aspects of solution, unless you both want to interact with each other on issues brought up. We have now time, some 10 minutes time for questions from the floor. I see already some few hands raised up. Kurt, Tomasz, and then Franz, as I see. Yeah. So far only men, so women, of course, also welcome to ask questions.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think it was an interesting thing, even though we didn't hear very much about the financing itself, but it's fine. I have a couple of questions. The June Ma's situation saying that essentially we should import all green things from China because it's cheaper there. Yes and no. I mean, long-distance transport, of course, has environmental costs and climate costs, which normally are not internalized. So, I mean, one has to be careful about, being too reliant on imports. One has to do these things as long as we don't really have truth in transport things. My question to Xiaodong is, what about agriculture? You didn't talk about that. You talked about emissions in industry and a little bit in transport, but we know, at least in Europe, that agriculture is an important emitter, and changes in agricultural practices can play an important role. And the third question is, what about zoning things in China? We know that there's a gigantic real estate sector which is in trouble, and zoning, where you locate essentially new buildings with respect to wherever the transport ways, that commuting ways that people have, also of course plays a large role. So could you say something about that too? Thank you.
Okay, I think we take all the questions together. Tomasz?
Thank you very much, Tomasz Lecic, Central Bank of Austria. You called for a pragmatic approach of the EU towards China, and you put also a couple of suggestions, but I find them very generic. So let's take the particular case in point, the automotive industry. The EU has maneuvered itself into the corner by via its regulatory policy. And I'm wondering which options the EU, with respect to the automotive industry, exactly has. What does it mean, a pragmatic approach? Because I only see three options in fact. One option is that the EU will impose tariffs on Chinese cars in one way or another, thus triggering trade war and all other implications that it might entail. The other option is to pull the carpet under the feet of the automotive, of the European automotive industry, which is losing out against the Chinese competitors, Chinese and US competitors. And the third option is to review its regulatory policy and delay or pull out of the 2035 combustion engine ban. I don't see any other option. So what exactly would a pragmatic approach in this sense mean? Thank you.
Okay, final set of questions with Franz Nauschnig.
Yes, one question concerning CBAM. You said CBAM will not have macroeconomic consequences. As CBAM just entered its test phase, CBAM had already worldwide massive consequences. For example, we in the European Task Force Carbon Pricing, we are talking with the Chinese since 7 or 8 years. And one of the reasons why the Chinese introduced carbon pricing, CO2 pricing, according to the European model was CBAM, because the Commission told them, either you introduce your own carbon pricing when you have income, or you pay the carbon border tax in Europe when we have income and we will not share it with you. The Chinese were a bit fed up, but half a year later we asked, how do you do it? And we introduced the carbon pricing according to the European model. I think this is a massive macro thing of CBAM before it even entered into force. And frankly speaking, CBAM will also have massive consequences for the US. We are also discussing it with the US. And with relocation of energy-intensive companies to the US, which is feared now, will be countered by CBAM, because when we want to export to Europe, we will have the CBAM. So you shouldn't underestimate it, and it will have really big consequences. And as to this car markets, I fear we could have the same effect as we had with the solar market, where Europe was dominant, as it was now, as it is now.
Okay, no comments. I mean, if you just could pose a question and then. But anyway, I think we have now 3 sets of questions. I think the first ones are rather on your topics, and the other 2 questioners, I think, would be rather than treated by you, Nico. Okay. But now, Xuandang.
Yeah. Okay, so first on the zoning question, I think that's quite important that China have this urban sprawl, have the thing. So that is really important, and also have this loss of ghost cities, which is a huge waste. And so that have a quite important implication for emission reduction. I remember we did a study in Canada and Toronto, the city center, the suburban emission per capita is 10 times more than the city center. So we're using that as example for Chinese. They really need to do that. And then on the agriculture, I have to say it's a little tough how to really reduce the emissions. And I can tell you, we are also doing the similar study for India now, for example, for the energy sector, because I'm responsible for the energy sector. Energy meaning the industry, transport, building, and power. And we got to net zero. And then my agriculture colleague came, and so we got to 300 million ton by net zero, and then he added another 600 million ton from agriculture, and then we thought, oh, we can't get net zero anymore. And I'm not an agriculture specialist, but we had this discussion, what we do about that. And right now, I understand, is quite difficult. So we kind of allocate more CCS kind of, space for these hard to abate sectors. So that's what we do. So it's difficult, yeah.
About import and transport issues, do you feel ready to respond to this question?
The automobile industry, yeah, I think
not only automobile, but the problem of if we only rely too much on imports, we have also the transport of these imports, which have to also to take into account. Does it play a role, the transport of raw material, but also products, consumer products, and so on, but also of PV installations, of windmills, whatever? Does this transporting all this material from China, is this an important factor? I would tend to say no, but I don't know what. I think it is important, but it's rather, from my perspective, rather something a minor aspect. But what's your opinion?
I have to say I haven't done that analysis, haven't seen analysis on that. But I know China is now, I know at least in Asia, is building these local, Indonesia, in other countries, trying to build a local manufacturing there rather than shipping all the way from China, particularly for like wind, for example. The transport become very difficult. So that they have done. And also the automobile industry, I think they have set up in Europe or something. So that's one way to mitigate that, yeah.
Okay. Now this leaves you with a lot of questions for you, Nico. Pragmatic approach, CBAM, and so on.
Yeah, thanks for the questions, both of them. First of all, to address the car industry dilemma, I do agree. Yeah, the suggestions are generic, but we need to have a set of fundamentals before we can talk about specific measures in specific sectors, right? So in terms of what the pragmatic approach for the automobile industry is, what you really nicely gave us is sort of the triangle of doom, right? Which is the three things we should avoid: trade war, let's not be overly dramatic, but a great reduction in the automobile industry, and the watering down of environmental legislation in the EU, right? So anything that happens within this triangle, I would say, is to some extent a pragmatic approach. A few points to be made here is there are, of course, and I'm not an expert on the automobile sector, but as far as I know, there are now large investments also in electric vehicles in the EU. If all the projects, for example, for the production of batteries actually take place by 2030, we will produce more than enough batteries for domestic demands. At least that's what the projections are that I saw. So in many ways, it's about bridging this interim period, and in the long run, we should also not forget that the market for electric vehicles is not just China, it's not just the EU, right? It's the US, it's the world, and there is, in my opinion at least, enough opportunity for both of these industries to flourish, but to not be overly optimistic. I mean, it is likely that the Chinese industry will dominate the next decades or so, which doesn't mean that the auto industry in Europe will fail, but it means it will probably have to restructure in some way or another. So I'm sorry if this is not the most specific answer, but I think this steering between different worst outcomes should be the basis for the pragmatic approach. To the question of the CBAM, yes, thank you for this addition. Wholeheartedly agree. In terms of the effects that I was mentioning, that the studies we did, of course, were done in a static setting, so they didn't simulate positive developments such as this. But yes, these kinds of positive spillovers are, I would say, a most welcome indirect effect or even direct effect of the CBAM. and I hope to see empirical evidence of what these developments have had, and yeah, I'm looking forward to research on that.
I'm afraid we have to stop here, and all the other questions you might have, you might then ask later on during the networking. Let me close this session, which leaves us with some hope. You already mentioned it, that things might change to the better. The French philosopher Corinne Peluchon argues that we must not confuse hope with optimism, which obscures the seriousness of the situation. Being able to see the possibility of a different future, even under very bleak prospects, this is the secret of hope. To hope means not having to suppress depressing facts, but rather being able to acknowledge them and to be ready for possible solutions. In that sense, let me thank the speakers for their stimulating insights, and please give them a round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah?
Yeah, thank you very much. We are now in for the concluding highlight of the CEEI 2023, and I'm very pleased to welcome the Vice Governor of the Österreichische Nationalbank, Gottfried Haber, who is going to chair the Financial Markets panel.
Thank you very much. Very warm welcome from me as well. My name is Gottfried Haber. I'm the Vice Governor of the Austrian Central Bank. And as we try to be as efficient as possible, we're just in the process of getting the microphones ready for everybody. I may ask the panelists to join me here as well. So, very warm welcome. Please have a seat. The second panelist will join us in a second when the microphone is ready, and our third panelist is online. So to save time, let me just start with the introduction, and then I will introduce the panelists to you. It will be a pleasure, and then we will go into several rounds of moderated discussion on the panel, and afterwards there will be enough space and enough possibility for a discussion with you. So, right now we have discussed various aspects about China's global role in the last 2 days, and thank you for being patient and showing such endurance to join us the whole time. China is by far the world's largest trader, and we have seen that China is not only an important provider of goods to the world economy, but also a vital consumer. On the other hand, we know that China is a very important player concerning financial market and banks. So, as I'm also responsible for banking supervision in Europe and in Austria, it's worthwhile noting that the large banks of China outperform the large European banks concerning some of the key figures. We have in China higher total assets and capitalization. We see higher return on investment. We see higher net interest margins and lower non-performing loan ratios than in the SSM banks. But right now, low inflation on the one hand and falling policy rates on the other hand recently supported further the continuous decline in net interest margins, among other factors there as well. And if we compare those net interest margins to emerging European economies, the CESEE economies which are in the center of our conference here, we observe that the net interest margins have come down from a comparatively low level of just 2.5% in 2014 to 1.6% in the half of 2023. Also, some Western experts question the reliability, especially of the very low NPL ratios and some of the figures as well. And finally, the current crisis in the real estate market poses a serious threat to financial stability. I think it might not be generally known that Chinese banks in Europe and European banks in China have a lot of activity. Let me just mention a few Chinese banks which are active in Europe. It's, for example, ICBC, Bank of China in Europe. They're also present here in Austria. China Construction Bank, the Agricultural Bank of China, they also operate in Europe. On the other hand, large European banks are present in China as well. So there is much of an interlinkage of the systems, the financial systems. For example, it's Banco Santander, it's Barclays, it's BNP Paribas, it's Crédit Agricole, it's Deutsche Bank, it's ING, and several others. For example, Intesa, Société Générale, and not to forget Raiffeisen Bank International, the large Austrian bank which is also present in China since 1995 and whose subsidiary in Beijing serves a bridging function between the Asian, the Austrian and the CESEE customers. So it is often claimed that foreign banks in China continue to be challenged by heavy regulatory restrictions in the market. Well, I always hear that with a kind of a smile, because if people say in China it's more intensive than in the euro area and within the SSM, that's very good for us in the SSM. But this is reflected in an almost non-existent role of foreign banks in IPOs in the Chinese market. So I think it's worthwhile questioning if that really holds true, and it's worthwhile having a few thoughts and a few words of discussion on that. On the other hand, we should closely look to China for lessons to be drawn, for example, with respect to CBDC, central bank digital currency. So I think not all of us are perfectly aware that China is very advanced in that discussion and has a yet working concept already being part of life, though the penetration of the market is still being low. But the concept of the CBDC they issued is quite advanced from the technical point of view and from the application point of view. So the yuan is circulating, according to the public figures, it's 0.16% of cash circulation. But compared to the huge market, of course, that's an even still impressive figure. Public salaries are paid on yuan in the city of Changshu, and this is a city of 1.5 million inhabitants, so it's nearly as big as Vienna, for example. So I'm convinced that it's interesting to talk about financial markets in China as well. And let me now, as we are complete physically and also virtually, let me introduce the speakers briefly here. So I might start with Jean Ma. He's the head of the China research at the Institute of International Finance. He has a lot of extensive experience as an investment banker in the United States and in China. With respect to the challenges posed by the Chinese real estate sector, I think you said, and I quote, China's home sales and new starts continue to slide and weigh down GDP growth. You also said, however, most home values are still significantly greater than their mortgages. And we see rising mortgage prepayments due to the falling interest rates, yet very few delinquencies. And banks have already pared down their exposure to developers, with only 6.3% of total bank loans going to home building. So I hope we can extend on that. Please give a very warm welcome to Jean Ma. Then our second physically present speaker, Christoph Pesau. He has recently joined one of the largest banks in Austria and is senior advisor to the board of Raiffeisen Bank International. He is both in professional terms and also in private terms a very profound source of knowledge concerning China. And he is convinced, and I also quote, that Europe and China have profited from each other ever since China started its opening up policy. This is especially true, you said, for the industrial sector. Looking forward, integrating financial markets can become the next stage of economic development for the two regions, especially given the current progress in financial technology. So also an interesting, strong hypothesis, and I'm eager to discuss that. And last but not least, unfortunately, just virtually present, but that's the benefits of modern technology. A warm welcome, and a warm welcome to Christoph Pesau as well before. We should always take the time to applaud to our distinguished panelists, of course. And last but not least, Michael J. Potters. He's Managing Director and Head of the Public Sector Group Asia for Citigroup. He's based in Singapore and joins us online. You might imagine what that means with the time shift, and so thank you very much for still joining us. Michael started his career in central banking at the Fed New York. He has collected experience in developing hedge fund, prime brokerage, and asset allocation businesses at JP Morgan and Bank of America. In the early 2000s, he was responsible for federal finance at the US Treasury Department. In the short term, Michael is optimistic on China. And there's also a quote I prepared for you. Please do not hesitate to correct me if the quote does not fit with what your core hypotheses are. Michael said, despite challenges, China's economy, the second largest in the world, is expected by most economists to grow by 4 to 5% this year. Should additional policy measures be required, China has the wealth and the political will to do what is necessary to boost growth and manage the financial headwinds in the property sector and elsewhere. Longer term, the country faces significant but not insurmountable challenges. The biggest challenge will be to continue to encourage and incentivize its energetic entrepreneurs, policies that determine and direct where, what, and how innovation should take place, risk the very dynamism that has led and may continue to lead to high levels of growth and wealth. So, a warm welcome to Michael Potters as well.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for joining here. As I hear you can hear us and we can hear you, that's great. So perhaps let me start and give you the privilege for the first answer, because you have the disadvantage of being offline or not being present here. But that's a question to all of our panelists I would like as a first round. So the first round, I would be interested in the cross-border activities of Chinese banks. That also fits in some of your hypotheses you just put forward, and I could cite. Let me try a little bit to challenge the optimistic views or the optimistic aspects of some of the views you formulated. China's global financial footprint has grown rapidly over the last decade, and China has provided significant financing to developing countries. So that's a really huge and important position of the Chinese financial market in global development. In many developing countries, financial conditions have deteriorated. So due to the pandemic, due to the monetary tightening that took place all over the world. So they addressed inflation and you know what happened in the world economy. So there is growing evidence that China's cross-border loans are coming under kind of pressure from credit quality and especially under repayment issues and liquidity issues. This comes exactly at the time where Chinese banks are dealing with a slowdown in the domestic growth and see pressure on the real estate market. So do Chinese banks have enough capacity to absorb losses, enough risk-bearing capacity to cope with this risk if loan portfolios deteriorate, and will China's cross-border lending activity evolve and continue if there will be losses in their portfolios. So perhaps if it's okay for you, Michael, if you could start with your thoughts on these issues.
Sure, thanks very much. I'm sorry that for some reason the video is not working, but I hope you can hear me. Basically, much of the exposure that you're referring to, especially in the emerging markets, really comes from the policy banks, China Development Bank, China Export-Import Bank. And since they're directly under the control and ownership of the State Council and the government, I'm more optimistic maybe than most people, because those are kind of institutions that certainly have the wherewithal if needed capital will be available for them. There has in fact been some reduction in the exposures, and by that I mean not so much overall lowering of the limit, but just in terms of new lending. For example, overall, Africa actually is the lowest it's been in 20 years. Now that's not a direct reduction, but it's an indication that things have slowed down a little bit. So I think we should be somewhat concerned. I'm not as concerned as many others. On the commercial bank side, I think there's just less exposure there. Again, because the Chinese banks, at least from my own experience and observation, tend to operate much more on a commercial basis. That doesn't mean they don't have exposure to some of the emerging markets, but generally are operating largely in Europe, the United States, elsewhere in Asia, and largely are supporting Chinese companies and corporations.
Thank you. Although we can't see you, we hear you clearly. That's great. So, well, let's perhaps Jean.
Thank you. Yeah. I can share some of my observation. I think Chinese banking sector is facing three kind of challenges. The housing sector in recession, local government are facing fiscal difficulties, and the third, as you mentioned, the quality of their external assets are deteriorating. Among these three, the thing that concerns me the most actually is the bank's holding of local government debt. I can explain later. The housing recession would hurt real activity badly, but the impact on banks is much, much smaller than people expected. Just no comparison between the impact in China and in Japan in 1990. That explains that later on. Regarding the external portfolio, we have to get data so we can put that in perspective. It's not easy to get data because some of the things are very non-transparent, but my best understanding is that right now, about $1 in $8 of China's external lending are in trouble. That's about right. However, the total China's external assets is only 2% of our banking assets. So the banking assets are predominantly in domestic market. The total loans marked as Belt and Road loans is about $700 billion. That's about 1.2% of a total China banking asset. That means if every single penny of those loans has gone bad, you raise that NPL about 1.2 percentage point. I also want to mention one more thing. Earlier, you mentioned about the China banking data. The level of China's NPL ratio is very puzzling, right? It seems too good to be true. Given all the troubles in China, the NPL ratio is about 1.7%. Okay? Well, there's a reason. That is in the past 10 years, PBOC basically encouraged the banks to write off the NPLs. And that number is there because the total number of bad loan write-off is public data. You put the number back, that is, if they did not write off the bad loans, China NPL ratio right now about 7 percentage point. That sounds right, right? So it's not that they get put out a razor and raise the number, give a new number, because they aggressively wrote off the bad loans.
Okay. So I would suggest that we switch to Christoph and then perhaps have some more in-depth discussion on what you just formulated.
Yeah, I think the question that you asked, there are actually 2 points, and I think Michael just mentioned the overseas lending, right, is mostly done by CDB and Exim Bank. So these are policy banks that report directly to the State Council. And I think we're seeing the deterioration also in the credit quality of the loans that these banks have given to countries. We see that already in discussions in the Paris Club, right? Because the Paris Club is saying, all right, you Chinese, you should take a cut. But China is saying, no, we don't want to take the cut, right? So that means there is a disagreement really in the Paris Club on that. And I think that China is pursuing a very different kind of lending than other lenders. Because look at Sri Lanka, right? What China is saying actually is like, why should we take a cut? You have assets, right? So we just take your assets. So we take your port in Hambantota, right? So that's a very different kind of lending, of policy lending that China has been doing actually. And China is also going, I think in that respect, they are also going to say, look, we know that the West actually has set up this system of cutting their loans, right? So we have seen this debt crisis before, right? But China, we have not been part of that, right? We have not been part when the West set up this system. So why should we, now we are powerful, why should we abide by the system? What's our incentive? So that's the one policy loan discussion. I think on the other hand, the commercial banks, the so-called commercial banks, it's important to know that they are also state-owned, right? Talk about ICBC, Bank of China. And there is actually a blueprint in terms of non-performing loans, because China was in this situation before, right? So what they did at the time, and I think that's 15, 20 years ago, at the time there were discussions about 20% non-performing loans in the Chinese banking system. So they cleaned their house, they set up 4 large asset management company and acquired the loans basically and worked out the loans to make the banks more viable, right? So that's of course a moral hazard issue. So the question is, that's really because if we really talk about risk-bearing capacity, at the end, the assumption is that the backstop is the Ministry of Finance there. Of course, also here, this will, because the banks are not 100% owned by the Ministry of Finance, but you would basically bail out the other equity holders. So I think there is still a long way to go on this, but in the end, this might be at the end game.
Mm-hmm. You said the final backstop, there is a perception that the Ministry of Finance might be the final backstop. When we talk about China, I think some people would have the fantasy that, let's say, in Europe, if there would be some, let's say, real estate crisis, then the real estate crisis would happen, and the banks would then be in the position to take the backstop at the ministries of finance and the public sector. For China, you could have the fantasy that perhaps the crisis might not even propagate to the banks, because there could be a government intervention already at the previous stage with the real estate sector, for example, and as we saw in the previous weeks and months, there might be some action towards the clients of the banks.
Yeah, of course. I think that was just a question on, are Chinese banks safe? So my assumption is they are safe. But as I said, it's a long way to go, and there are many steps that the government could take before it even comes to these defaults.
Is it more likely in the Chinese economy that, let's say, preemptive steps or steps at the previous stage are taken in order to protect the banking system? Is that more likely than in United States or Europe?
Yeah, PBOC has a nickname. Basically, the nickname is Big Mama. And he has 5 sons. These are the 5 big state-owned banks. PBOC do whatever it takes. The latest action to help banks is to cut deposit rates to maintain the NIM spread. So I can talk about the impact of housing on Chinese banks. The housing recession is very, very deep. The home sales and new housing start they were down by 40% and 24% in 2022 last year. They were down again by 20% and 16% this year. Okay.
And if I got the figures right, the share of GDP of the real estate sector is around a quarter, around 25%.
It's big. Directly, real estate plus real construction, about 12% of GDP. If you consider all the spillover effect, indirect, the upstream, downstream impact, easily 25. It's big. However, I think the policymakers back about 7-8 years ago, they made a very clear decision. They believe housing is too big, have become the cancer of this economy. The housing sector is consuming too much capital, too much resources, even carbon emission, because China's high-rise towers are concrete and steel. And that is a problem of many social ills. You ask why young people are unhappy because they cannot afford a home. You ask why the restaurant is so expensive because they cannot afford the rent. And they thought what happened in Hong Kong in 2018-19, they believe the housing situation played a big part in the discontent in Hong Kong. So they just cut it out. So they mentioned the phrase that housing is for living in, not for speculation, back in 2017. They began tightened policy bit by bit. Didn't have much impact in 17, 18, 19. Then I think in 21, as Alicia mentioned, the three red lines, we tightened the credit to developers. That is something broke the camel's back. The whole housing crashed. So basically, they performed this operation to cut off this cancer, but the operation is unfortunately a bit messy, and they performed this operation when the patient is in COVID. So that was bad. So I think this will hurt the whole real activity badly. So people complain, well, China not consuming enough. Okay, they didn't spend money on consumption. Well, if you look at the spending on services, it's very strong. The restaurants are doing well. Airfare, hotels are in fact quite expensive right now because of strong demand. At the same time, anything housing related are in depression. Okay? Furniture, home improvement, white appliances, anything housing related are still deeply depressed. So I think the housing may stabilize in 2024, but it will stabilize at a very low level, right? In terms of volume, it's about only half of the volume before COVID. So that hurt the GDP number and also hurt the Chinese imports, right? Because housing sector is a commodity heavy. So I brought some investors to Beijing in mid-September, and someone in PBOC told us this. He said, well, you see, this year we may manage to achieve a little bit of 5+ growth. Okay, it's not fantastic, not too bad. But what we can achieve this 5% growth with 1/4 of the GDP in recession, right? So which means this is an economy built less on steel and cement and more driven by chips and batteries. So that's great. That's exactly the high quality GDP growth we wanted for so many years. So that actually explains why the stimulus policy coming out from Beijing, there were some, but not as much as people hoped. So that's why China does not import much, because the stimulus is just China not import much. So they're running large trade surplus. And at this moment, the economy is just not growing at a potential.
So before I would like to ask Michael a little bit more on the international aspects, I think we have not shed enough light on the part of the question dealing with the expectations on the presence of China in international markets and international finance. So first, just a short question round with yes or no, or slightly more words than yes or no, but very limited to all of you. Do you think that China's role in international finance will be continuously strong, increasing or decreasing?
Depends on policy.
Okay.
Depends on geopolitics is what I think.
Okay, so ceteris paribus, if everything is unchanged? That's the bad questions, I know.
Yeah, right. No, I
but
think
you would say they're interested in still being present and
definitely.
Okay.
I think there is an interest in working together and cooperating. The question is if policy allows that, right?
Okay. So if it's possible and markets allow, and especially politics allow, there will be an increase in international cross-border activity.
I think the footprint of Chinese financial sector abroad right now, in fact, is smaller than people think. The role, I think, is overblown a little bit by the media. Because anything Chinese, it's put on front line. So I can explain that. And the role will shift quite a bit from the reserve money and the loan into FDI and the portfolio in future.
So you're talking about, well, if you open up media and read every commercial harbor in Europe and in the world belongs to Chinese companies, that's not the truth.
I'll give you some fact, right? Yeah, China has a large foreign exchange reserve, a lot of money parked in your treasury. That's the story a couple years ago. Right now, the new story is China buying everything in Africa. Okay, but the truth is, the Chinese FDI in Africa is tiny. The Chinese FDI in Africa is probably the size of FDI by Italy or Belgium. It's that small.
So that would also imply some
a lot of loans
potential to increase. Yeah. So you would also be on the optimistic side, or let's say on the expansionary side, that there might be increasing activity of Chinese financial markets in FDI in foreign markets.
It's true, Chinese banks made a lot of loans because Chinese banks are big. How big? The total asset of Chinese banking sector is about 2.5 times of US banking sector, and about twice of the European banking sector. That's how big it is, because the capital market is not very well developed. So all the finance is intermediate through banks. That's why it's so big, giving the saving. In the past, China's financial footprint abroad is through FX reserve. That's why people tracking their Chinese investment in your treasury bonds all the time, and then also loans made by the big banks. And at the same time, at this moment, the portfolio investment is tiny. And the total financial assets, the external asset of China, the IP, the international investment position, the total external asset in China is about the same size as Japan, about $10 trillion. But it's smaller than Germany. Germany, I think, is about 13 or 14 billion trillion dollars right now. So the size is there, but the allocation is very different. For example, Japan has about 4 trillion portfolio investment all over the world. China has 1 trillion.
Okay.
So I think that the composition will change over time.
So thank you for giving us the dimensions to get a feeling on all of the process. Now we see Michael as well. Great to see you. Hopefully audio still continues working after consuming bandwidth for video. So let me come to you. First, the same short question as to the others. Do you see at least continued or increasing interest in being present in cross-border finance and taking part in international markets for China?
Yes, absolutely. It will continue to increase. It's the second largest economy in the world. It continues to grow, even with its challenges at 4, 5, 5.5%. I don't see any other outcome. So and with what Jean had said and Christoph, I don't disagree. But in my view, I'm much more optimistic.
Yeah. During dinner yesterday, they said it's always interesting if there is much disagreement, but it's also good to get some of the opinions confirmed, and if there is no disagreement on the panel. Michael, perhaps we can stay with you at the moment. So all of you basically said there will be a perspective of increasing or continued interest in maintaining the importance of Chinese finance, if I may put it so, in international markets. So you're very close to the markets there. So what's your view on regulatory frameworks, on governance? Do you think that if China even tries to increase international presence, that there might be, some measures to take if there are some measures needed to strengthen the framework? And do you see a need for improved data quality? Because if we talked about the NPLs. I think there was a good explanation and a good reason on the figures. Now we better understand, and I think that's in line with data quality requirements we also have here in Europe or in the United States or in Singapore. But do you think there is an increased need for such topics? Perhaps let me give you one personal observation. When we had the opportunity to have an exchange with our Chinese colleagues in summer, for the supervisor and me, it was a really great experience, because when I asked Chinese commercial banks, are there any expectations towards the supervisor and the regulator, they looked a little bit stumbled and said, the regulator is right, and we will do what the regulator requests us to do. Yeah? I would really love to hear that from our banks in Europe as well sometime. But
different.
yeah, so I mean, the compliance to regulation, what I want to say, and to get serious again, I think the compliance is really high. But does the framework need to be some readjustment?
The short answer is yes. But rather than get into all the details, and because there's always debate on exactly what those regulations should be and then how they're enforced, I go back to, if you think of it this way, as first principles. First and foremost is the more transparency, the better. And I would say that not just for China, I would say that for any country in the world, especially if you've got, like I do, I believe that Chinese banks, et cetera, will continue to play an increasingly important role internationally. It's not just about the regulators. What you want is the international press, your counterparties in trading and in loans, to be able to see the data that's coming out. And the way you do that is being as transparent as you possibly can. And the second one follows shortly thereafter, and that is data quality. But the transparency comes first, because if the data quality isn't good, those that are looking at it transparently will be able to tell that the data is not good. And the data, it's not even that it's not good. It's just that, economies these days continue to evolve and change so quickly that data that was perfectly fine 10 years ago actually might need to be revised significantly now. And the way to get that the fastest and an indication are from your counterparties, whether you're borrowing money to them or lending money to them or trading with them. Because anybody that does is going to be looking at those kinds of things in terms of managing the risk and then the pricing.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's an important and interesting topic. I would love to discuss that for hours, but there are some other topics we have on our minds. Are there any remarks on that question? Because we will have opportunity for Q&A of the audience, and I would like to save some time for that.
I can make a quick comment following on Michael's comment regarding China data and the regulation. I think the whole financial sector in China is evolving very rapidly. So I think regulators are having difficult time to catching up with the development in the market. I'll give you one example. The stock market trading volume in Shanghai is huge. If you look at the turnover, right, the amount of trade divided the market cap, it has one of the highest turnover among all the stock market in the world. So that's great for the quantitative and also the high frequency hedge funds. So you have the Russian guy set up hedge fund in Shanghai, do the high frequency trading because the volume is so big. And it takes quite a while for the regulator to realize the problem. because in such a case, it's like you are driving a Ferrari in a neighborhood faster than everybody else, right? You create a danger in the neighborhood, and they are taking advantage of the retail investors. So they have to come up with regulation, how to regulate the quantitative and high-frequency trading. They are constantly fighting those battles right now. Sometimes you feel these people are too slow, inept, but they have to understand the situation they're facing.
Mm-hmm. So perhaps let me come to another big topic we already mentioned. It's the internationalization of the currency, and it's the topic of e-yuan and CBDC. As we said, there is an increasing role of CBDC. It started, market penetration is quite low at the moment. Christoph, you're not only from the professional point of view an expert on China, but as I mentioned also, you spend a lot in China and an expert in also living there. When I went to China the last time, I made the observation that as a foreigner, without any WeChat Pay or the apps you have to use there, it's not even possible to get a cab if you want to go back to the hotel. So if you put it the other way around, there is a highly developed payment system already in place in China. And when we talk about CBDC in Europe and in other Western countries, one of the core arguments against CBDC is that there is no use case. If you have a developed payment system, why would you need CBDC? But China proves that things might be different.
Yeah, I think the European situation and the Chinese situation are very different. I think if we, I'm sure there are going to be conferences on the digital euro very soon in the near future. So I think from what I understand on the CBDC in Europe is that right now there is still a lot of cash payments, and then in addition you got a lot of American cards. You don't have that in China anymore because in the 2010s. Basically a duopoly emerged of WeChat, Tencent, and on the one hand, and Alipay on the other hand. So people don't use cash anymore, actually. So retail payment is done via mobile phones, also on the internet is done via mobile phones. But what this has done is basically it cut out the banks. So the banks don't have access to these retail payments anymore. So from what we discussed with the PBOC is actually that they are trying to get back to square one, actually. They say they want to give the banks one more shot to do better than they have done until now. So that's what PBOC is trying to do. That's how I understand it. That's the one part. The other
so if we try to put it together, that implies that the framing is different for the banks. In Europe, it's a threat to the business model of the banking system, partly at least, or financial intermediation, or some see it as this. In China, it's some kind of chance for the commercial banking system to be in again.
Yeah, because they lost already. They lost the first round, right? Yeah. They lost their retail customers, a lot of these retail payments. And I think what's also important from a Western perspective, whenever I talk to somebody in Europe and then they think, oh, the Chinese, they're doing that CBDC, the digital yuan, right? Because they want to control everything, link it to the social scoring, etc. I think that's actually not the case because the PBOC or whoever wants the data can go to Alipay and to Tencent and say, just give us the data, right? So you have it, give it to us. So I think there is no need from a government perspective to put another large payment system in place for that. I think really in the domestic market, it's more giving the state-owned or the commercial banks one more shot in this game. So that's the one point.
But that's really a little bit in line with some kind of anecdotal evidence when you ask people in China, do you have any privacy concerns with CBDC? My feeling was that people are not very concerned because they say they know everything anyway, so why care about additional data that might be disclosed?
It's already there, everything, right? So so your mobile phone basically gives you secrets away, right? So that's the one perspective. The other perspective, and I think that's much more relevant to us, is actually the role of the digital renminbi in international trade, right? Because over the last few years and decades, we have seen what it means for a bank to be cut out of SWIFT, right? So you implode pretty quickly, apart from the Russian experience, I think, but that's just a very large country. But still, they're having the issues without SWIFT, right? So that's, if you can manage to build an internationalized e-yuan CBDC that you can use for doing trade, then you can basically take a shot at SWIFT, right? Because if that works internationally, then you don't need SWIFT anymore. And I think the PBOC has been doing a pilot project with Thailand, Singapore, Hong Kong. So I think that's a development that's much more relevant to us in Europe, actually.
I think CBDC can serve many purposes. So for example, in many places in Europe, in Singapore, in Hong Kong, a lot of small merchants still do not want to take credit card, right? Because Visa, MasterCard charge them 2%. American Express can charge 3.5%. So that's why when you use credit card, you get your miles, points, lounge access. Why? Because Amex and Visa, they charge 2 and 3% from merchants. And if you have a CBDC, you save merchants 2 or 3% of their income. So that's great. In China, things are not identical, but similar. That is the large internet companies like Tencent and Alibaba are eating banks' lunch. But they get payments, and through payment they get data. Because they have better data than banks, they can price the loans better than banks can. And PBOC being the big mama to protect the banks, and they have to push out the CBDC to help banks.
Well, I think there would be hours or days to spend with that topic, just with the European CBDC project and also with what we can learn from China. I think the impression that we get from that pilot project is that it's really advanced concerning the technical features, and it's really worthwhile looking in detail into that. I would like to go into the Q&A part of our discussion, to have a little bit room for that. Just a short remark, disclosing my limited knowledge of perhaps some economic fears we have. You know, sometimes we talk about the issue that it might be a risk for financial markets or for payment systems if Chinese currency might be used for payments also within Europe and other currency areas. So the fear I hear from the discussion is always on the side, it might be a problem if another currency extends to your realm and to your currency area. From the economic point of view, as an economist, as a simple economist, I always had the question, from the point of view of transmission of monetary policy, it might be more bothering if your own currency spreads on a global level, because you might not be in control of your monetary aggregates, and the spillover and the shifting from domestic to non-domestic monetary volumes might be also an issue. So as long as the denomination is of prices, of wages, of mortgage loans and so on, as long as the denomination is in your domestic currency, I think we should distinguish in that discussion. But that's just an appetizer for the next conference on China. Let's start with the Q&A. So we have 1, 2, 3.
Well, thank you very much. Just 2 questions from an investor's perspective, and I would like to hear the opinions of the panelists here. So we have not heard about the stock market yet. I mean, Chinese stock markets, different marketplaces, huge market capitalization. The Chinese stock markets, excuse me, are number 5, number 6, bigger than the German stock market or even Euronext, as a matter of fact. So from an international investor's perspective, and we heard 5% growth rate despite deflation, would you advise an international investor to invest in Chinese stocks, or Should they be more concerned about the risk component with regards to geopolitics and potential sanctions? Second question, we heard the renminbi is rather weak, which should help on the exporting side. From an investor's perspective, would you expect any carry trades out of China into US dollar?
I would suggest that we collect some of the questions. We have one there.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. My question is concerning the international role of the Chinese currency. Now we have around 60% dollar, around 20% euro. What do you expect? What will be the role of the Chinese currency? And will we get to a tripolar international monetary system concerning dollar, euro, and the Chinese currency?
So great. I'm glad my appetizer worked right now.
Just as a kind of spillover from the previous session on green finance. I mean, here there is a lot of things going on in China as well. Regulation on disclosure, there is a taxonomy, there are similar things going on as we have in Europe. But what is the perception of Chinese banks or the Chinese financial system on this? Is it just a minor issue, or is it a similarly big story as it is in Europe right now, ESG and all that stuff? Thank you very much.
And I would take the fourth question or comment. And we have two online, one online. So I would suggest that we take the four, and then we have, I think, one and online again. Please.
Thank you for this very insightful panel, and it has a very positive undertone. So I want to ask a critical question about the policy making. You give us the impression that all is good, that the regulator knows what is to be done, that the data are not as bad as the West thinks, and that there is transparency, there is compliance, and they know what they do. If I look at the housing problem, they have developed this problem far too way and should have intervened much earlier. The municipality debt load is out of control. And I also must say the way they turned around in the COVID pandemic really undermined my trust. And I think that the impression I have is that the policymakers are more prone to errors than you made us believe. I'm sorry, it was maybe not put in a very positive tone, but I wanted to really raise this critical question.
Great. So I would ask all the three of you to try to pick whatever you feel might be your field of expertise and would like to answer, and to keep it short so that we can have a second round of small questions. So perhaps Michael, if you would start.
Great, thanks. Let me take the one on the international role of the RMB. That's a great question. The challenge, China has all the attributes for the RMB to be a reserve currency. You know, it's a large economy. It's important to the world. It's a large exporting, importing economy, etc. It really comes down to the political decision. Anytime a country or a currency becomes a reserve currency, it's ultimately a political decision, not by saying we want to be a reserve currency, but it's a political decision because of all the other decisions that need to be made on an economic side. And the first and foremost is you need to have an open capital account. Without that, you're not going to be a reserve currency, because you can be an important currency for trade, but trade is only 10% of the capital flows. Capital flows are 10 times the trade flows. And you know, if you're a reserve currency, you're not trading anything, you're actually in the capital markets. So that's where the challenge for China comes in. It has all the attributes. It's just a question of the decision to actually open the capital account and all the ramifications that has.
Okay, thank you. Christoph.
Yeah, I think that's also what you just mentioned, right, on the carry trade. So I don't think the carry trade is going to happen just because China has these capital controls in place. So that's the reason why. And I think on the question on the stock market, I think there is a reason why Chinese people invested in apartments and not in the stock market, right? So that basically led us into that into the situation that we're now in with the real estate sector.
I can make two comments. One's also got the carry trade, the other one stock market. I don't think CNY can be a funding currency like Japan's yen during that time, because after all, the interest rate is not on the floor. But at the same time, the reverse of interest spread is a driving force of the capital outflow right now. Many people are seeing this chart, the chance of FDI is collapsed, because FDI usually the bar is positive, now it's negative this year. But they didn't tell you that chart, the data, includes the reinvested profit. Okay, foreign companies earned a lot of money during COVID days because China was the only supplier to the world for many products. So they earn a lot of money, can get reinvested. But this year, the export slowed, and PPIs at the floor, so now they're making much profit. And then they found out, wow, dollar rate is 30 basis points higher, so let me send my money to Ireland first, because there's no tax. So I think that's driving force. I can also tell you another anecdote. I have a good friend. She sold her second home in Shanghai and tried to get money out in Singapore. Because of capital control, she can only bring $50K a year out. So she literally went to the ATM machine in Singapore, withdraw the daily maximum every single day. He went to a different ATM machine, didn't want to get caught. And so that flow, where does it show up on BOP? So that outflow show up not on the capital account, rather than the tourism spending, the service deficit. Because that's why the service deficit is so big, because they are withdrawing money. And after a week, she received a text message from ICBC. We noticed we're withdrawing money every day. Should we alert authority on anti-money laundering background? So she stopped. So it's yeah, because of the spread. Because you're earning nothing in China, and if you put money even in the US money market fund, you earn 4.5 these days. So that's on carry trade. On stock market, I think the reason the performance is so poor is not because of the GDP number, but rather because of no inflation. GDP number, I think this year will be 5.2. It's not great, but not too bad. Basically, you get 2-year average 4%. It's below potential, right? That's why you have no inflation, jobless rate is high, and you have a large trade surplus. That's the indication the economy is not growing at potential. And among the most damaging thing is that the price is really at the floor. Nobody can make a penny. So that's why the stock market.
Yeah, thank you.
Pay attention to PPI.
Thank you for that. I noticed as an advocate of the audience that 2 questions have remained unanswered. So the one is perhaps some of you could pick up. Is greening the economy and green finance mentally, I understood the question, as important as in Europe? So is it just the mega trend is here? First, Christopher.
Yeah, I think Chinese banks would say, we heard it's also a big topic in Europe, because we're the largest green banking sector in the world, actually. So I don't think if they're very strong on the S in ESG, but I think in terms of the environment, they're trying to do that a lot.
And is it an issue for investors and the domestic audience?
I think it's more regulator driven.
Okay, great, thank you. So we had that as well, and we had some words on the transparency or the data quality. I think your anecdote you depicted. We would not like to go into more detail and not interfere with criminal investigations or AML issues, but I think it showed that data is not always 100% reliable. But that would hold true for other countries and jurisdictions as well. The example.
Just look at just non-farm payroll data. That's a total mess, right?
Yeah. So you said is everything fine, or is the positive picture, is it correct, or are there any severe issues we have?
I can take a question. I think her question is on Beijing's policy making. I think I think the record is pretty mixed. It certainly has like success and failure. Success, for example, the green transition is tremendous success, right? And to a very large extent, thanks to the policy drive. But at the same time, the housing policy is a total mess. I think is this, the policy making in Beijing, they have made too many levers to pull. So oftentimes they may be slow to react, and especially when they react slow, then by the time comes, they're very heavy-handed. So that's why they cause a lot of collateral damage. COVID lockdown is one good example, housing is another. But they are really good policymakers to, with great detail, with meticulous plan out of the policies, like for green transition and Made in China 2025. And Made in China 2025 is much verified, smeared, maligned in the media. But if you read the document in detail, it's very much like the industry policy coming out of Germany. Then didn't talk about dominance at all. There may be subsidies, but not subsidies were not in document. The whole document is all about how to green the industrial sector, how do you integrate IT and manufacturing, and how do you improve the quality of Chinese products. And so that's a quite interesting thing if you read it.
Okay, thank you. So we started 10 minutes later, but still I would like not to extend in too much, of course. But I would also not like to discriminate the people which are virtually present here. So how many questions do we have? It's the one question, so please take my apologies. I saw one raised hand as well in the audience here, but take my apologies. We have the virtual raised hand, which had been in the first round. So could we have that question, please?
Yes, this question is from Vytenis Čipinis from the Lithuanian Central Bank. And he says, there's a lot of talk about de-risking with respect to China. Does this trend imply that EU and US companies active in China are now more inclined to acquire financing from EU and US banks rather than Chinese banks? And he would also like to know whether you have any other observations on how geopolitics affect the banking sector in China.
So, thank you very much. So perhaps the two bankers here, what's your impression? Is that a boost for other banks in other regions?
Well, I mean, for now, I don't think it is. I think in general, in terms of de-risking, the discussion is still, I think, is still ongoing on what this will entail, actually. Because, I mean, some time ago, I think we had a meeting with Jay Powell, and he was, at the time, 1.5 years ago, he told us that he thinks that it's much too expensive to really decouple. So I think it's a political slogan right now, and we will, because also from all the data that we have seen in the presentation so far, it doesn't show in the figures, actually. So we will need to see what the future holds, I think.
So, Michael, you would be most probably one of the beneficiaries of such processes, and Singapore there is some vicinity of the markets as well. So what's your perception on that?
Let me just make two very quick points in terms of companies preferring U.S. or European banks or Chinese banks. Haven't really seen, like Christoph said, haven't really seen evidence of that. But my second observation is that, and I know many of you have probably seen this because it's been in the press, but we see it very clearly. Companies around the world continue to move into China and move foreign direct investment into China because it is simply too big a market not to be in. 1.4 billion consumers with a fast-growing middle class. If you're a CEO of any of the Fortune 1000, you cannot not be there. It doesn't work. However, what we are seeing is that quietly and very slowly, because these things take time, production for export that now is in China is slowly being replanted elsewhere. So it's a phrase that I know many of you have heard, but in China for China. And that's why the money continues to flow in, but quietly, because nobody wants to talk about it, is you're seeing companies moving their production for exports around the world to other countries, particularly in ASEAN and South Asia.
Thank you. As there are still some open questions, I'm confident that's a good sign and a good indication that you enjoyed at least part of the discussion here. And it's an incentive for you to come back again the next time. So at this point, let me thank all of the distinguished panelists. Thank you, Michael, for joining us from far away, from a different time zone. Thank you, Jean. Thank you, Christoph. Thanks to all of you. Yeah, it's always a good time for applauding the panel. Yes, thanks to all of you for staying with us, for spending with us 2 interesting days. I am very much looking forward to the opportunity to welcoming you the next time as well. I'm sure all of the people who made this conference possible and who made it, in my views, of course, I leave it to you, but in my view, it was a success and a successful exchange of knowledge and a successful discussion. Thank you very much to all of you at the OeNB who made this possible. Thanks to the team and everybody who made it without any, let's say, anything you had to, you could notice that something could have went wrong. Nothing happened. So thanks a lot to everybody. Thanks a lot to everybody participating also virtually, and all the best, and hopefully see you next time at the CEEI again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.